Chapter 1. Madelyn White took a deep breath as she approached the table of an older woman. "Hello, may I take your order?" The woman looked at her with a smile. "Yes, please. I'd like a chicken pot pie." Madelyn nodded, glancing over her shoulder as she saw her manager, the bane of her existence, watching her closely. Mr. Humphreys had made it plain he planned to court her, whether she wanted it or not. He was an ardent admirer, and he had no plans of changing his ways. "Yes, ma'am. What would you like to drink with that?" The woman frowned at her. "Is that man making you nervous?" Madelyn swallowed hard. She rarely talked to the customers at the restaurant she waitressed at other than taking their orders, but this one seemed to be willing to listen to her. She stepped closer, and carefully lowered her voice. "He's my manager, and he's interested in me romantically. It doesn't matter to him that I don't return that interest." "Is he causing problems for you?" Madelyn shrugged, not sure how to answer. "He follows me home from work, and he tries to kiss me in the back room. I don't know how to get away from him. When I leave the boarding house to go to work, he's standing outside waiting for me. I want to get a new job, but I haven't been able to find one. May I borrow your pen?" Madelyn handed her pen to the woman, wondering how on earth that was going to help anything. She watched her as the woman wrote something down on a scrap of paper she pulled from her reticule. When Madelyn was handed the paper, she read it with a frown. Miss Hazel Hughes. An address was there as well. She frowned. "Do you want me to visit you?" Miss Hazel nodded. "I do. I have a proposition for you. I assume you're not averse to marrying a good man?" "Of course not." Madelyn had no idea what was going on in the woman's head, but she wanted to understand. "Come see me. Come straight to my house after work, and we'll chat. I promise you, I can offer you something better than what you're living with now." Madelyn frowned but slipped the paper into her pocket. "I'll be back in a moment with your chicken pot pie." "What would you like to drink?" she asked again, hoping she'd get an answer this time. "I'll have a cup of tea." Madelyn nodded and hurried off toward the kitchen. That had been a strange exchange, but she might have to check on what the woman was able to do to help her. Or what she thought she could do anyway. Madelyn had moved to Ottawa a few months before, thinking that she would find her fortune there. All she'd found was that the men in the city were even pushier than the men back home. She gave the order to the cook and sighed. She would probably need to go see this Miss Hazel and see what she wanted from her. 6 hours later, Madelyn was walking alone through the streets of Ottawa, trying to find the address on the paper Miss Hazel had given her. She'd waited until Mr. Humphreys was dealing with a customer complaint before she slipped out the door, knowing he wouldn't drop what he was doing to follow her. She stopped in front of a huge house, checking the paper in her hand one last time to make sure this was the right place. The home was much bigger than any she'd ever stepped foot in, and she was more than a little intimidated. Gathering her gumption, she stepped up to the door and knocked. It was all she could do not to run instead of waiting for someone to come to the door. There were mounds of melting snow all around, and she was glad March had brought some warmer weather. This winter had seemed as if it would never end. The door opened, and Miss Hazel stood smiling at her. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either. But I'm here. Come in. We'll talk. I'm Hazel Hughes, but everyone just calls me Miss Hazel." "I'm Madelyn White." "It's very nice to meet you." Miss Hazel led her to a small parlor. "Now you wait here while I fix us some tea so we can talk. You won't run away, will you?" Madelyn smiled. "If I was going to run away, I'd have done it while I was waiting for you to come to the door. I'm never cowardly when people are watching." Miss Hazel laughed. "I'll be right back then." While she waited, Madelyn looked around the room. It was beautifully furnished, and there was a small desk at one end of the room. There was a stack of letters on the desk, and it made Madelyn think Miss Hazel must be a wonderful correspondent. She felt comfortable there in a way that surprised her. She'd thought she'd feel a bit overwhelmed by the affluence of the home, but instead, she felt as if it was welcoming her. Miss Hazel was back a moment later with a tray laden with a teapot, 2 cups and saucers, and a plate of cookies. I hope you're hungry. Madelyn nodded. We eat lunch at the restaurant, but that's the only meal we're allowed. It's been many hours since I've eaten. Miss Hazel put her tray onto a low table and sat down across from Madelyn, quickly pouring the tea. I forgot to put cream and sugar on the tray. Would you like me to fetch either or both? No, thank you. I take my tea plain. Madelyn took the cup Miss Hazel offered, and picked up a cookie, taking a quick bite and feeling crumbs fall all down the front of her uniform. What a mess she was making. Miss Hazel would think she had no manners at all. I want you to tell me about your experience with your manager. Have you done anything to indicate you might be interested in him at all? Miss Hazel took a sip of her own tea, studying Madelyn over the rim of the cup. Madelyn shook her head emphatically, spilling a bit of her tea in the process. She wasn't normally so clumsy, but she was very nervous about this meeting, having no idea what it was about. I haven't accepted any of his invitations, even when it would have benefited me to do so. I don't want to encourage him in any way. There had been a couple of evenings when she'd first arrived when she realized she'd be going without supper if she didn't accept his invitation, but she'd still refused. How long has he acted this way? Miss Hazel asked. I've only been in town since the end of September. I met him my first day on the job, which was shortly after I arrived in town. I interviewed with the owner, not with Mr. Humphreys. And did he act interested in you from the very beginning? Madelyn wasn't sure why this mattered to Miss Hazel. Yes, he did. And I politely told him I wasn't going to date my boss. All right. Miss Hazel stood and walked to her desk, picking up a piece of paper and carrying it back. She settled back in her seat and took another sip of tea. Madelyn squirmed a little, wishing Miss Hazel would get on with whatever she'd asked her there for. Instead of asking any questions, she reached for another cookie, enjoying the taste. These are wonderful cookies. They're so light. Miss Hazel smiled at that. What do you know about Mounties? Mounties? The Royal Northwest Mounted Police? As much as anyone, I suppose. They police our great country. Yes, they do. My son is a Mountie. Oh, that's wonderful. I'm sure you're very proud of him. Madelyn had no idea where this conversation could possibly be going, but she'd do her best not to be rude. I am. He and his wife are expecting my first grandchild. Madelyn smiled at that. Babies are a blessing from God, they are at that. Miss Hazel studied her for another moment. I'm a matchmaker. I found the right young lady to marry my son, and I took her to him. I've matched several Mounties with their wives now, and I'm becoming known within the Mountie organization. So you are a matchmaker who finds brides for Mounties? Miss Hazel nodded. You'd think that with as dashing as they look in those uniforms, they would be able to find their own wives, wouldn't you? You would think. Madelyn had never actually met a Mountie, but she'd seen photographs. She was sure they were much more dashing in full color, though. I have a letter here I would like you to read. It's from a Mountie stationed in Manitoba. Madelyn accepted the letter and read through it slowly. She understood now. Miss Hazel had brought her here hoping she'd be willing to marry a Mountie. She was sure she wasn't interested in marrying a stranger, but she was very interested in the letter that was in her hand. Dear prospective bride, I write to you to tell you about my situation. It's my hope that you will take pity on me and become my bride. I'm a Mountie assigned to a small village in southeastern Manitoba. There are 3 other Mounties here, and we all share duties. Mine are a bit more difficult for me because I'm raising 3-year-old twin girls. My wife died in childbirth 3 months ago, and I find I'm incapable of raising the girls on my own. I need someone to care for my girls and my home. I'm not looking for love at the moment because I'm still very heartbroken over the death of my wife. I know this isn't the romantic letter you were looking for, but I promise to be a good, faithful husband. I will provide as best I can. All I ask is that you love my girls. Sincerely, Gilbert Keeler. Madelyn read the letter through once more, her heart going out to the poor man and his daughters. I'll do it. She didn't even think before she said the words. Why would she? She had known she was meant to be with them as soon as he mentioned his daughters. Miss Hazel smiled. You didn't think you were interested, did you? Madelyn shook her head. I didn't. After reading his letter, I know I am. Those poor girls. My class starts Monday morning, bright and early. If you'd like, you're welcome to move in now. What class? Madelyn was suddenly lost again. She liked Miss Hazel, but her conversational skills seemed to be grossly lacking. Oh, did I forget to tell you? I teach a week-long class for all the brides I place. I want to be certain they know how to cook, clean, and bake. Mounties don't need to be disappointed by the woman who gets off the train to marry them. All right. I'll be here Monday morning. That meant leaving her job immediately, and she couldn't be happier. The money wasn't good, but more than that, Mr. Humphries made her very nervous. I think you should move in immediately. Your situation isn't the same as most. You need to get away from that man. Madelyn bit her lip, a habit her mother had always scolded her for. I couldn't impose on you that way. Impose? My dear, I'm a widow with no one around me unless I'm teaching a class. I would be very happy to have you here. A few extra days of companionship will please me to no end. I have another of the brides living here already, but she's busy taking care of her daughter, who just had surgery. You two will live close to one another, and it would be good for you to become friends. I'd have to go get my things. And frankly, she was afraid to do it. With the way Mr. Humphries watched her every move, there was no way she could do it, unless she left at the dead of night, which wasn't exactly safe. I'll send someone with you. Give me a moment to make a telephone call. Telephone? She had a telephone? Madelyn had never even spoken on one, and Miss Hazel jumped up to make a call as if she did it all the time. Madelyn read through the letter twice more, her heart breaking for the little girls. She imagined Gilbert to be tall and much older than her. She had no idea how she'd feel about him when she met him, but the girls. She already knew she'd love them. Every little girl deserved a mother who would love her, and she was determined to be that mother. 20 minutes later, she was sitting in an automobile with a stranger, being driven to her boarding house. The man had been instructed to wait out front for her while she packed her things, and if any man tried to bother her, he was to contact the police. She hurriedly packed her things, thankful she had such a tidy nature. Her room was virtually spotless already, and it was nothing to gather her belongings into her carpet bag and head for the door. As she opened it, she saw Mr. Humphries leaning against the rail on the front steps. He caught her arm as she walked by. Where are you going with all your things? That's none of your business, Mr. Humphries. Today was my last day of work as well. I hope you find a new waitress quickly. She felt a burning in the pit of her stomach for leaving the restaurant with no notice, but she couldn't tolerate the man for another day. You're supposed to work the afternoon shift tomorrow. You have harassed me for the last time, sir. I'm done with you. Now let go of me, and I'll be on my way. You didn't tell me where you're going. To marry a Mountie. Do I need to send him to have a talk with you? She knew the threat was empty, but she hoped he wouldn't realize. He released her as if he'd been burned. Marry a Mountie? You could have had me. Goodbye, Mr. Humphries. She rushed to the car waiting for her and climbed into it. The driver started the vehicle and headed back for Miss Hazel's. Did he hurt you? No, sir. He may have if I hadn't told him I was about to marry a Mountie, though. She smiled, pleased with her solution. She had no desire to spend another moment in Mr. Humphries's presence, and now she wouldn't have to. Once she was safely back at Miss Hazel's home, she put her things in the room she was assigned. She quickly unpacked her things and descended the stairs to talk to Miss Hazel. He was waiting for me, so I told him I was marrying a Mountie. He backed off pretty quickly. Miss Hazel laughed. I think that's wonderful. He shouldn't have pestered you to start with. No, he shouldn't have. But I don't have to worry about him any longer. Have I said thank you yet, Miss Hazel? You don't have to. I'm thrilled to have another young lady to marry one of our men in red. Gilbert thanked the young lady who had been watching his children all day. She came over every day that he needed her, and he paid her what he could. He should never have taken Sally for granted. She'd been a good wife to him and a good mother to his girls. As soon as she was gone, he dropped to his knees and spread his arms for his girls. They ran to him, hugging him. "We missed you, Daddy," Mary said. The girls looked similar, but thank heavens they weren't identical. "I got a letter today," he told them, standing up with one in each arm. "There's a nice woman in Ottawa who is going to marry me and be your new mama." "Will she be nice?" Millie asked. Millie was always worried about how people would treat her sister, but she wasn't nearly as worried about how she'd be treated. Mary had a softer heart than Millie, and it was obvious to everyone around them. "I believe she will, but you girls will need to tell me if she's not." "What will you do if she's not?" Mary asked, her eyes wide. Gilbert laughed softly. "Why, I'd have to stick her out in the snow." Millie giggled. "I'll be sure to tell you if she's not nice to us." He set the girls down and looked at the stove. The teen who watched the girls sometimes cooked for them, but more often than not, she left the job up to him. He reminded himself that he should be thankful she took the time to watch them. Even though she was paid, she was staying out of school to do it, which he hated. "Pancakes for supper?" he asked, a smile on his face. Mary groaned. "We had pancakes last night." "And the night before," Millie added. "Pancakes it is." Bert knew that feeding his daughters pancakes every night was a form of cruelty, but the truth was, he couldn't cook anything else. He got out a mixing bowl and quickly mixed up some batter. The girls sat at the table, watching him cook. Though they didn't want pancakes again, they wouldn't complain. They both seemed to understand that he did his best for them. After supper, he tucked them into their bed on the other side of the blanket he'd strung across the cabin to give the girls their own room. He sat down on the edge of the bed and told them a story of their mother. He tried to tell them a different story of her every night so they wouldn't forget her. She had given them life and had a right to always be remembered with love. When they were both asleep, he stood up and walked back into his room, pulling the letter from the pocket of his red uniform jacket. He sat down and read it once more. "Her name is Madelyn, and she's going to love my girls like they're her own. What more can I ask for?" Chapter 2. Starting Monday of the following week, Miss Hazel's house was filled with young ladies. There were 4 of them total, all going out to marry Mounties in the town of White Fox, Manitoba. Madelyn was pleased to know there would be other ladies she knew as soon as she arrived, but it was still hard for her to wrap her mind around the fact she'd be married in a matter of days. The classes were all good, but they covered things Madelyn was already skilled at. She could easily have taught them all, so she was more than a little bored most of the time. When it was finally time to leave for Manitoba the following Monday, Madelyn had butterflies in her stomach, and she just hoped she wouldn't disappoint Gilbert. She wanted to be the best mother she could possibly be for his girls. At the train station in Ottawa, right before they got onto the train, Barbara began to cry hysterically. "I can't do it. I can't go marry a stranger." She glared at Miss Hazel. "How could you even ask it of me? Have you lost your mind?" With that she hurried away from the platform, and Miss Hazel stared after her for a moment with shock on her face. "What are we going to do now?" Miss Hazel asked, frowning at the other 3 girls, as if it was somehow their fault that Barbara had run off. "I promised 4 brides would be delivered to White Fox, not 3. "You'll have to find someone to take her place," Madelyn suggested. "Surely there's a woman at this train station, as big as it is, who needs to escape somehow." All 4 women looked around, hoping to see someone who looked sad and down on her luck. Not that Madelyn wanted anyone to be sad, but it would surely help them with the predicament they were in. Finally Madelyn spotted a young lady sitting alone on the train platform, her bag between her feet and tears coursing down her cheeks. "Over there, Miss Hazel?" She nodded toward the young lady, not wanting to point because that would be incredibly rude. 20 minutes later, Miss Hazel returned and introduced everyone. "This is Callie, and she'll be traveling with us." No other explanations were given, and Madelyn was afraid to ask. "It's nice to meet you, Callie. I'm Madelyn." They were just in time, because the conductor was calling, "All aboard." As their days of travel dragged by, the women got to know each other even better than they had. Miss Hazel was a source of amusement for all of them. She always seemed to get herself into strange situations, and the stories she told of her travels made them all giggle. Madelyn found herself sitting beside Ida, helping her to care for her little girl, Lily. Madelyn had always loved children, and it was no hardship to spend her time helping to tend the child and give Ida time off. "I hope Lily will be friends with my little girls," Madelyn said, her eyes bright and excited as she thought of the girls who would soon be hers. Lily's small scar on her lip meant nothing to Madelyn, though she knew the girl had been bullied as a result of her cleft lip. She was nervous about the wedding but very happy with the thought of the little girls. When they finally arrived at their destination, there was a small train station, and that's where 4 Mounties stood tall and proud, ready to meet them. Miss Hazel led the way off the train, and they all looked around. Madelyn couldn't help but wonder which of the men was Gilbert. She wished he'd brought his little girls along. They were the ones she was truly excited to meet. Miss Hazel marched over to where the men stood, and she introduced each of her charges. "This is Madelyn. Is one of you Gilbert?" A tall man with dark hair and eyes nodded at her, and Madelyn stepped toward him. "It's good to meet you," she said softly. "And you?" He nodded cordially, looking her up and down. She looked nothing like his sweet Sally, and that was probably for the best. He wouldn't want to accidentally fall in love with his wife. "Where are your girls?" she asked. Meeting him was not the part of her journey she'd been looking forward to. "They're at home. There's a teen girl in town who comes over to watch them. I'm sure she'll be very happy to get back to her studies now that you're here. I'll gladly take the responsibility from her." Madelyn couldn't believe how much she was looking forward to having daughters. She wanted to cook, clean, and make them pretty little dresses. She'd even purchased a bit of fabric before leaving Ottawa. Now she just had to meet them so she would know their size. Miss Hazel called out, "We're going to the church for the weddings now." Madelyn couldn't help but wonder how that would work. Would they all marry at the same time? Or would each wedding be separate? She walked alongside Gilbert and realized they had never even touched. He hadn't tried to hold her hand or anything, and she was going to be his wife in a matter of minutes. What did that say about her? When they reached the church, they went in as couples. The pastor stood at the front of the church, eyeing each of the ladies who came in. He frowned when he saw the child who held Ida's hand, but Ida held her head high. Gilbert looked at Madelyn. "Would you like to be first?" She nodded, happy to get it over with so she could meet her new daughters. "I'd like that." They stepped in front of the pastor, who seemed to be looking around critically. Madelyn was not looking forward to hearing him preach. "Is there any reason you shouldn't be married?" he asked Madelyn. "I've never married, and I'm 19 years old. I can't think of anything else that anyone would care about." She lifted her chin and met the preacher's gaze. There was no way she'd back down from the man. She couldn't help but hope he would be reassigned or that he was a traveling preacher who would only be there for a short while. "What is your name?" he asked her. "Madelyn." "All right." He began the proceedings, and she responded where necessary. When he called the man beside her Bert instead of Gilbert, she filed his nickname away for future use. "You may now kiss your bride." Bert looked down at Madelyn, suddenly feeling very shy, which was odd for him. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her cheek, hoping that would satisfy everyone. He wasn't going to kiss her for the first time in front of a group of people. He didn't feel like he was ready to kiss a woman other than Sally yet either. His wife was still too dear to his heart for him to be that affectionate with another. He didn't see that ever changing. They stayed at the back of the church and watched as the other couples married, and it was all Madelyn could do not to touch her cheek where he'd kissed her. There had been a spark that seemed as if it was static electricity when his lips had touched her. Why would that happen? She felt nothing for him. He was simply the father of the little girl she already loved, sight unseen. After all the weddings, Madelyn hurried over to hug Miss Hazel. Are you leaving right away? Or will you stay? Miss Hazel smiled. You don't think you'll get rid of me that easily, do you? I just want to thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't happened into the restaurant. I don't think I could have fought him off much longer. Madelyn kept her voice to a whisper, not wanting her new husband to realize the circumstances of her agreeing to marry him. If she chose to tell him in the future, that would be her business. For now, he had no right to know anything. I'll be staying here in town for a day or two. There's a hotel above the saloon, and I'll be perfectly comfortable there. Madelyn wanted to invite her to stay with them, but she had no idea what kind of situation she'd be going to when she arrived. I hope I'll see you before your departure. Of course you will. You're one of mine now, Maddie. Madelyn smiled at Miss Hazel's use of her childhood nickname. It was one she'd always liked, but it hadn't been used in months. I'm so happy to hear that. Bert cleared his throat, hoping his new bride would take the hint. He was ready to get home to his girls. Surely she could understand that they came first in his life. Madelyn turned to him and frowned. I'm very sorry. I'm sure you're ready for us to be on our way. Yes, I am. My girls are very anxious to meet you. I'm anxious to meet them as well. Very excited actually. Good. Madelyn thought about telling him that she wouldn't have agreed to marry him if not for the girls, but she knew the words would be offensive. Tell me about them. He smiled. They're 3. They're not identical, thank heavens. I'm not sure I could have dealt well with not knowing which girl was which. What are their names? She'd called them a million different things in her mind as she daydreamed about them on her way to Manitoba. Learning their real names was exciting for her. Mary and Millie. Millie always seems to think she needs to protect Mary, but I'm not quite sure why. They're both very sweet-natured and excited to be meeting their new mother. He stopped in front of a small cabin. I must warn you, it's not much. Government-issued cabins are rarely anything special. Madelyn shrugged. Things like that have never bothered me. It'll be special, because we'll make it a home. He smiled, liking her words. He opened the door and waited for her to enter in front of him. Before he had a chance to introduce the girls, he heard one of them asking, "Are you our new mama?" He was pretty sure it was Millie, but it was hard to tell when he couldn't see them. I am your new mama. Madelyn squatted down so she was at eye level with the girls. I'm so excited to finally get to meet you. I'm Millie. That's Mary. The little girl pointed to her sister. We need a mama. Can you cook? Madelyn laughed. I love to cook. I hope you girls will help me. Both girls nodded, and Madelyn looked over her shoulder to see Gilbert looking down at her with a smile. They enjoyed helping their mother cook a great deal. She felt a shiver run through her at his smile. The man. He was something else. She hadn't expected to be attracted to him at all, planning to treat him like a roommate. Why were the feelings there when she was just there to be a mother? I'm glad. I will enjoy having such good helpers in the kitchen. She rose to her feet. Are you hungry now? Bert could see she was handling the girls just fine, so he paid Emily. Thank you for helping me out. I'm sure you'll be pleased to go back to school tomorrow. Emily nodded. I will be, thank you for the work. My parents have been very pleased with the extra income. Bert watched her go before looking again at Madelyn. She seemed to be getting along beautifully with the girls already. I got some pretty blue fabric to make you both dresses before I left Ottawa. Would you like to see it? Both girls nodded emphatically, and Madelyn reached for her bag. It was the first time Bert noticed she carried one, which was silly. He'd known she would have to bring clothes with her. He should have offered to carry it for her. She opened her bag and pulled out a few yards of blue calico with a pretty flowered print on it. I can't wait to make this into the 2 most beautiful dresses you girls have ever seen. Bert realized the girls had both outgrown their dresses, something that he'd missed before. He should have had something new made for them long ago. That will be a blessing. Where should I unpack my things? She asked. There wasn't much to unpack, but she wanted to get settled in before she started supper. "Let me give you the quick tour," he said. "This is the main room. Kitchen also serves as the parlor. Nothing fancy here." She noticed there were 2 sheets hanging across the different parts of the cabin. "I don't need fancy." "That's a good thing." He led her to one of the curtained-off areas. "This is the girls' room." There was a small bed that was obviously meant to be shared by the 2 of them. "I like it," Madelyn said, aware that the girls were watching her reaction. "What beautiful dolls." Millie giggled and hurried into the room, picking up her doll to show Madelyn. "This is Nancy. She's wonderful." Refusing to be outdone, Mary hurried into the room and picked up her doll, holding it up. "This is Sarah. They have beautiful names, to match their beautiful faces." Madelyn wanted the children to be happy. Everything inside her was screaming at how unfair life had already been for them. They were too young to have lost their mother. Bert smiled at her, realizing she genuinely was happy to meet his daughters. It was a relief, because he had nothing to offer her but the 2 little bundles of energy running around the cabin. His heart would never be hers. "This other room is the room we'll share. I've put all of Sally's things into a trunk so there will be room for yours. Would you like me to use her clothes to make more for the girls?" Madelyn asked. She knew that's what she would have wanted. Bert shook his head. "Maybe someday. I'm not quite ready for that yet." "I understand. How long ago did you lose her?" She looked around the room as she asked the question, noting there was only 1 bed, so they would be sleeping close together. "Just 4 months. She died in childbirth, and we lost my son as well." The lines around his eyes were proof that he'd slept little in the past few months. "I see. How long have you been here?" "We arrived 6 months ago. I fear that our travel here may have been the reason they didn't make it." He still hated himself for the death of his wife and son. "I'm very sorry for your loss. I promise, I will not try to take her place with you. Only with the children. The girls need a mother much more than I need a new wife." "I'm glad you can understand that." Even though it was what she'd known she was coming into, Madelyn felt as if it was a physical blow when he told her. She had hoped after meeting him that he would feel something for her, too. His kiss on the cheek had made her feel more than she'd thought possible. Hopefully she would be able to hide her growing feelings from him. "I do understand. You made it plain in your letter that there would be no chance of love between us." She walked to the small dresser and quickly put her things away. She didn't have much, so it only took a short while. "I'll get started on supper." He nodded, watching her go. He hoped the girls would be happy for the sacrifices he'd made for them. Madelyn hurried into the kitchen, pulling on her apron as she walked. "I sure wish I knew where the food was." Millie was there in an instant. "It's in the icebox." She opened the door to the box, showing Madelyn the food there. "Daddy bought food yesterday. He said you'd feed us." Madelyn grinned. He was right. "I'll feed you all the time." "What's your favorite food?" "Anything but pancakes." The little girl wrinkled her nose. Mary came up behind her. "Please don't make pancakes." "I won't." "I would think you'd like pancakes though." "Most people do." Bert walked into the room and sat down at the table. He wanted to watch her with his girls before he left her with them the following day. "Pancakes are the only thing I know how to cook. We've had them more than anyone should ever eat them in the past few months." Madelyn nodded. "That makes sense. I'll be certain not to make pancakes for a good long while." She looked through the icebox, frowning as she tried to see what she could cobble together for a meal. Finally, she pulled out some pork chops. "Are there potatoes?" He nodded. "In the cellar. I guess I should have shown you that." He moved a rug out of the middle of the floor, and pulled a ring, opening up the cellar. "Bring a lantern." Madelyn grabbed a lantern from the countertop and used a match from beside the stove to light it. "You girls wait here." "Yes, ma'am," Mary said, watching her as she went down. At the bottom of the stairs were shelves of food. Many different canned goods filled rows of shelves, and there were carrots and potatoes as well. Sally got the canned goods put up before she died. It was one of the last things she did. I'm sure I can find something to work with here. Madelyn put her hand on his arm. I'll do my best to be half as good a mother as she was. He pulled away from her as if he'd been burned. Why had her touch caused his body to react? That wasn't why she was here. I'll see you upstairs then. With that he headed for the stairs. He knew he was being rude, and he should help her carry the food up, but he just couldn't. She wasn't Sally, and he had no right to react to her at all. Chapter 3. While she made supper, Madelyn was aware of Gilbert's gaze on her constantly. The girls were standing on chairs turned backward at either side of her, dropping cut potatoes in the water to boil and nicely arranging carrots. Why she needed nicely arranged carrots, she didn't know, but if it made Mary happy to do it, she was happy to let her. Once supper was on the stove cooking, she lifted each of the girls down and untied the towels she'd used for aprons for them. I think you're both going to need a real grown-up apron. Is it okay if I make them for you? The girls nodded excitedly, their braids bobbing. Yes, please. Millie said, speaking for both of them. Madelyn hadn't taken long to learn that Millie was the voice for both of them more often than not. Like yours? Mary asked, her eyes bright. Just like mine. But prettier. Maybe I could put your names on them? Bert was pleased with the way she treated his girls and smiled to himself. I'm sure you'll need some things to make clothes for the girls and to cook with. I'll give you an allowance every week for just that purpose. Money was tight with all he'd had to pay out for child care, but he could see already that she had his daughter's best interests at heart. I have some I saved from my job in Ottawa. I'll let you know when I need more. Madelyn was fully aware that he couldn't completely trust her yet. They'd only met a few hours before, even if she was his wife. He frowned at that, but decided to let it go. Maybe he could replenish his own meager savings if she used a bit of the money she'd earned. I leave for work early and sometimes come home late. It'll be nice to have someone the girls really like watching them. She frowned at that. They didn't like the girl who's been watching them? He shrugged. I don't think they disliked her, but they didn't take to her as they have to you. I'm hoping that is a sign of good fortune. She dug around in a cabinet until she found everything she needed to bake a cake. Would you girls like to have a cake for dessert? She asked. Mary clapped her hands together as Millie said, Oh, yes. Do you know how to bake a cake? Both girls shook their heads. Well, you're about to learn. She pulled down a mixing bowl and carefully added each ingredient, explaining what she was doing to the girls as she went along. Then we use a little lard to keep the cake from sticking to the pan. And we pour the batter into the pan and stick it in the oven. Wasn't that easy? Millie nodded. Now Mary and me lick the bowl? Madelyn laughed. You have done this before, haven't you? She got them each a spoon and handed it to them, inviting them to go at it. When she looked up, Gilbert's eyes were on her once again. She wanted to demand why he was staring at her because he made her uncomfortable, but he was her husband, which meant he had the right to stare at her all he wanted. You've spent a lot of time around children, he said. It wasn't a question, just an observation. She nodded. I was the daughter born of my mother's first marriage. My father died when I was still an infant, and mother remarried soon after. I have 6 younger siblings. It was always my job to watch out for them. They're still in Ottawa? He asked. No, sir. They're in a small town a few hours north of Ottawa. I left in the fall. My stepfather wanted me to marry right away, and there was no one in the area I was interested in marrying. So I left to go to the city and make my own way. It made things easier for my mother. He frowned. I wouldn't have treated a child that way if you'd had one to bring to the marriage. She shrugged. I was happy to move away. And she had been until Mr. Humphreys came along. Then she was happy to leave the city and come here. Hopefully she'd made the right decision for herself and the precious children with her. She stood and checked the potatoes, realizing they'd need another few minutes. Peeking into the oven, she saw that the pork chops were ready and the cake was rising nicely. It wasn't the meal she'd have chosen to make if she'd gotten to shop and purchase whatever she wanted, but she would soon be allowed to do just that. Is there a store in town? When they'd walked through it to her new home, she'd been so nervous walking beside him, she hadn't noticed. On the other end of town. Just past the train station. Open Monday through Saturday. So I didn't miss it by being distracted. We didn't walk past it. Thank you. I'll go there and see what I can find. The girls love walking to the store, but don't buy them every little thing they ask for. They're rather greedy when they think they can get something. His eyes met Millie's, and she looked down. She obviously knew he meant her. I won't get them everything. But she certainly wasn't above buying her new stepdaughters some treats. Getting along well with them was extremely important to her. When supper was finished, she got the meat from the oven and mashed the potatoes. Would you like gravy with this, or do you prefer your potatoes without? She felt badly that she hadn't had time to bake a loaf of bread. She promised herself she'd do it tomorrow. Along with a million other things that needed to be taken care of around the house. There was laundry to be done and so much cleaning. She was certain the floors and walls hadn't had a proper scrubbing since his wife died. If then. Being pregnant made scrubbing the floors difficult. As soon as they were all seated around the table, Gilbert bowed his head and the girls followed suit. Madelyn smiled to herself, pleased that her new family would be people of prayer. That was very important to her. While they ate, Gilbert talked to her about what the following day would be like. It was Thursday evening, so just one more day before the weekend, though she didn't know if he'd work Saturday as well. The girls will be entirely your responsibility. From the sounds of it, you know how to take care of them, so I won't tell you how to do it. Madelyn nodded. I'm well aware of how to care for children. She mentally went over her to-do list for the next few days, wishing she had a piece of paper. It was so satisfying to cross something off a list, knowing that she'd done her best to do a good job of it. The girls still nap in the afternoons, so you'll want to make sure any errands are run before lunchtime. They'll tell you they're not tired, but they will fall asleep sitting up if you don't make them go to their bed. Madelyn smiled at the picture that made in her mind. I'll make sure they nap. Good, I'll try to be home by 6 every evening. If I'm not, don't wait supper on me. A Mountie's life can be unpredictable. He rubbed the back of his neck, thinking about the train robbers that had been plaguing trains all across the West. They hadn't hit White Fox yet. All of the Mounties agreed it was just a matter of time, though. They were certainly on the lookout for any dangerous activity. All right. I'll keep things warm for you if I can. If not, I'll put it into the icebox and reheat it when you get home. That's perfect. And so were her pork chops. He'd never tasted any quite so moist and tender. Supper's good. Thank you. She smiled at that. It was the first compliment he'd given her, but she hoped for many more. When she'd first gone to the city, she'd wanted to be a cook, but everyone had considered her too young. Now she would have her wish of raising children and cooking for them. She couldn't be happier. I'm so glad you like it. She stood up and checked on the cake, which was done. There's nothing to use for frosting, but I'm sure it'll be good as it is. She carefully cut 4 pieces of the hot cake, which should have had time to cool before she served it. It didn't matter too much, though, because she knew it would taste wonderful. She'd always loved to bake. Putting a plate in front of each of them, she sat down and picked up her fork, taking a bite. She smiled. It was perfect. Good. She didn't want him to be able to find fault with her. Millie took a bite of her cake and smiled happily. Good cake, Mama. Madelyn felt tears pop into her eyes. It was the first time one of the girls had called her Mama, and it was music to her ears. Don't burn your mouth, she cautioned. Mary said nothing as she tucked into the cake, polishing it off in moments. Yummy. More? Madelyn's eyes met Gilbert's. How do you feel about sweets so late in the day? Gilbert smiled. I would usually be against it, but the girls haven't really had anything sweet since their mother died. I'm sure it won't hurt them to have another piece. She jumped up and got them each another piece. Would you like more, Gilbert? I would. And most people just call me Bert. She nodded. All right. Bert. She set the second piece of cake in front of him. Are you a coffee drinker? Should I have some ready in the morning? Show me a Mountie who doesn't drink coffee, and I'll show you a man who will be asleep in his saddle before noon. Coffee first thing in the morning. I think I can handle that. After supper, she quickly did the dishes while he told the twins a story. At first she didn't listen, and then she realized he was talking about Sally. The story he told was about how important the twins had been to his first wife. She wiped away a tear when she was sure no one was watching. He still loved his dead wife with all his heart, and he was going to do his best to keep her memory alive for his girls. It was both good and bad. She knew she'd never measure up, but she was pleased that they would have good memories of her. When the dishes were done, she turned around to see him sitting with a girl on each knee. Would you like me to put them to bed? She asked softly. She was happy to do it, but she didn't want to usurp his position if he was happy to do it himself. Go ahead. He watched her every move with them as she led them into their bedroom and carefully dressed them both in their nightgowns. These are getting too tight, too. I'll make some more. I think I'm going to have to buy out all the white fabric the store has tomorrow. I want you to have aprons and nightgowns that fit. She tucked them into bed, a smile on her face. I'm glad I came here to be your new mama. Thank you for letting me. She kissed each cheek and went to the curtain. I'll see you in the morning. As she lifted the curtain to go out, she heard one little voice say, she's a good new mama. We'll have to be good so she won't want to go away. Madelyn's heart went out to them. They'd been hurt by their mother's death in a way she wasn't sure Bert was even aware of. Going out into the main room, she saw him sitting quietly in a chair, a book on the table in front of him. Thanks for being good to them. It's not a problem. I care about both of them already. So much. She walked toward the curtain. I've been traveling for several days, so if you don't mind, I'm going to go to bed. I'm exhausted. He nodded. I'll be in shortly. He didn't want to think about lying beside her in the dark as he had with his Sally. There shouldn't be other women in his life after he lost his true love. How was that fair to anyone? He waited as long as he could before joining her behind the curtain. He undressed in the dark as quietly as he could. He could hear her even breathing and knew she was already asleep. She'd worked hard after a very long train ride. He needed to respect her sleep. Slipping into the bed beside her, his arm automatically reached for her, but he pulled it back just before he touched her. What was he thinking? She was there to take care of his children. Nothing more. The sun wasn't up yet when Madelyn woke the following morning. She felt something heavy across her waist and looked down to find Bert's arm stretched across her. She eased out from under it and grabbed clean clothes, taking them into the kitchen to dress. It was cold in the pre-dawn hours of the morning, but she did her best not to make a sound. She didn't want anyone joining her until she was fully dressed. She lit the fire and looked in the icebox once again, finding bacon, eggs, and some milk. She could start her baking for the day, and then she'd make scrambled eggs once her family began waking. While she needed the bread she'd bake that day, she couldn't help but think about what it meant to her to have a family of her own. She wouldn't be asked to leave if she didn't marry fast enough. Oh, her mother had said she could stay, but her stepfather had made it very clear he didn't want her around any longer than absolutely necessary. By the time she heard someone else stirring in the quiet cabin, the sun was rising and shining in through the windows, and she had a huge bowl of bread dough rising. She started the bacon, wanting to have breakfast ready before her new family even had a chance to even say they were hungry. She was just serving the first plate of bacon and eggs when Bert joined her in the main room of the house. Something smells good. Madelyn grinned at him, handing him his plate. I'm limited by what you have on hand, but after I go to the store today, I'll be able to cook better meals. I don't need better than this. He sat down and looked at her. Where's yours? It's just about done. You can start without me. I don't want yours to get cold. I'll wait. It was only polite. He still didn't feel comfortable around her. There was something about the woman that made him forget for a moment just how much he missed Sally. She scooped her eggs onto her plate and sat down across from him. Should we wait for the girls? He shook his head. They're late sleepers. They won't be up until at least 7. All right. He bowed his head and prayed for them, and she picked up her fork, taking a bite of her eggs. They were good, but she usually added just a tiny bit of seasoning to her eggs. She couldn't do that here. All he had on hand were salt and pepper. She'd find something while she was at the store. What are your plans for the day? He asked. She reached for the piece of paper she'd made a list on while everyone slept. Lots of things. Do you want to read my list? He glanced at the list, seeing it filled a page. I have a feeling I'd get tired just reading it. Don't wear yourself out. I want you to remember the girls are more important than any housework. I want them happy. I'll do my best. I plan to start our day with a trip to the store. They'll both enjoy that. He finished his breakfast and drank down the last of his coffee, wiping his mouth with the napkin beside his plate. I hope to be back before supper, but I can't make any promises. She nodded. I understand. I'll make sure the girls are taken care of. Thank you, that's all I can ask. With that, he pulled on his red serge jacket and buttoned it up. Have a good day. You too. She briefly fantasized that he would come over and kiss her goodbye, but the sound of the front door closing told her that he had no intention of getting that close to her. With a sigh, she carried their breakfast dishes to the basin and heated some water for the dishes. She had to keep herself from falling in love with her handsome husband. Even though it might be too late. Chapter 4. Madelyn's day with the girls was more fun than she'd imagined it would be. Sure, there was a lot of work to do, but the girls were enthusiastic about helping, and Madelyn had always enjoyed hard work. She was not one to sit around being idle. They walked to the store together, and she chose enough food to make it through the weekend. She also bought white linen for nightgowns and aprons for the girls. She couldn't wait to have them both wearing tiny aprons like hers, and she knew they were both excited by the prospect. As they walked home from the store, the proprietor had promised to have everything delivered by noon. The girls skipped and jabbered back and forth the whole way. As soon as they got home, Madelyn slipped the bread that had been rising all morning into the oven. Then she fixed a huge pot of soapy water so she could scrub the walls of the cabin. The girls each took a cloth and they worked on the floor while she did the walls. She taught them a fun song as they worked, and it was an enjoyable time. The girls liked helping her, and she liked having them beside her. She would have to go back over what they'd cleaned after they were in bed, but she really didn't mind. After lunch, she saw that Bert was right. The girls were practically sleeping as they sat up. She got them into their bed and started on the laundry. She should have done it early, but her morning had been full of other tasks. For supper, she made one of her favorite meals as a child, chicken and dumplings. She was dropping the dumplings into the broth when the girls woke up from their nap, and they came over to watch her. Stay back now, I don't want either of you getting burnt. Madelyn could just imagine Bert's reaction if she burned one of his girls on her first day alone with them. The girls asked for bread, and she buttered them each a piece. Now we're just going to hope that your daddy will be home in time to eat supper with us. It was already 5:30, and if he wasn't there, she would need to feed the girls without him. The bread would tide them over for a little while, but not for long. I'm going to go check the clothes on the line, to see if they're dry. Madelyn had only managed to do the clothes that day. Monday would be her day to start on all the bed linens. The cabin needed a good spring cleaning, and with her 2 little helpers, she knew it would all take at least a week. I come. Millie jumped down and carried her bread with her to the door, looking back at her sister, who followed, carrying her own piece. All right. Do you think it's ready? Madelyn asked. Millie shrugged. No. No? Well, what will we do if all of our clothes are wet, and we can't wear any? Mary giggled. Madelyn touched the clothes and was pleased they were dry. She piled them into a small basket and carried them inside, the girls holding one side while she held the other. That's how Bert found them as he arrived home from work. His pretty new wife carrying one side of a laundry basket, and his little girls carrying the other side. They seemed thrilled to be able to help, and his heart warmed toward her. How could she be a bad person when the girls were obviously enamored of her? He walked over and took the basket from the three of them, startling Madelyn, who hadn't seen him watching her. She'd been too busy giving every bit of her attention to his girls. I'll carry it in. Thank you, Madelyn said softly. She was still shy around him, knowing she was developing feelings she'd never wanted to have. You're welcome. He looked down at his girls as he pushed into the house, amazed at the smells. He was almost drooling as he set the basket on the counter. Please tell me supper will be ready soon. It smells amazing. Madelyn smiled. I'll butter a piece of bread for you like I did for the girls. Supper will be another 30 minutes. He frowned. I'm not sure I can wait that long. The bread will get you through. She hurried to the counter and cut off a piece of the bread, buttering it and bringing it to him on a plate. You eat this while I get the laundry folded. The girls didn't swarm him as they usually did. They were content to be with their new mama, helping her with everything they could. He didn't like that their affection had seemed to transfer, but he couldn't complain too much. As he watched, she showed them how to fold a kitchen towel, and they each tried, making jumbled messes. She was patient, praising them for trying, but showing them how to fix it. When she was done, they both had folded a towel that didn't look like it was just a wadded-up mess like they had at first. Now we need to put them all away. Can you help? The girls took their clothes to their room to put away, jabbering excitedly. Madelyn looked over at Bert. I got the fabric to make them each a new nightgown and an apron today. I hope you don't mind. If you keep cooking like this, I'm not going to mind a single thing you do. You could burn down the cabin as long as I knew you were roasting a slab of meat over it. She laughed, the sound filling the house. I will do my best not to burn down the house for any reason, but I will make as many slabs of meat as you can eat. You have yourself a deal. I will eat anything you're willing to cook. His first wife hadn't been a fabulous cook, but he'd loved her to distraction. He was thrilled Madelyn was such an experienced cook. You could make your living as a cook, if you weren't so busy being a wife and mama. Well, let me know if you ever get tired of being a Mountie, and I'll open a restaurant. Can't you just see the girls' waiting tables? She was very amused at the picture in her head of the girls each carrying a big tray with food on it. He frowned. He knew she was joking, but did she want to open a restaurant? Is that something you want? For the girls to be waitresses? Never. I was a waitress in Ottawa, and I hated it. She wasn't ready to mention Mr. Humphreys, so she left that part out. I did it for 5 months, and I was so grateful for the chance to come here and be a mama instead. No, I mean, have you ever wanted to open a restaurant? She shrugged. I like to cook, and when I first arrived in Ottawa, I wanted to be a cook, but no one thought I could possibly be experienced enough. So I waited tables. He frowned. I don't want to think that you're not living your dream because you're here with my family. If you want to open a restaurant, maybe we could work that out. I don't, unless you need me to earn the money. I'm happy staying home with the girls. And maybe someday having children of her own. A possibility she had completely discounted before getting on the train to meet him was now in the back of her head. She had feelings for the man. How had that happened so quickly? I'd rather you were here with the girls. Good, I'm glad we agree on that. She filled her arms with the clothes she'd just finished folding and carried them behind the curtain into their bed area, calling over her shoulder, I am too. I was worried you wanted me to earn a living and not stay with the girls. He waited until she came out. Not at all. You're certainly talented enough in the kitchen to run a restaurant on your own, but I asked you to come here so you could take care of the girls. Mounties rarely stay in one place long enough for a business to be started either. She hadn't thought of the possibility of moving. She was happy there with him and the girls, but she wouldn't mind if they had to pack up and move the next day. For her, life was all about family. And the three of them were now her family. There's no need to worry about that. I don't see myself becoming discontent with taking care of the house and the girls. I can cook for 3 people or 100 people. Makes no difference to me. She walked to the stove and pulled bowls down out of the cabinet. Carefully scooping up half a bowl for each of the girls first, she set them on the table to cool. Then she filled 2 bowls for the 2 of them. Are you all right with drinking milk with supper? Or would you prefer water or coffee? Milk is good late in the day. Thank you. I drink a lot of coffee throughout the day, and I don't need it this late or I'll be up all night. She poured 4 cups of milk and put them on the table before going to look for the girls. They'd put their clothes away, but they hadn't come back out. It's time to eat. The girls nodded, walking into the kitchen and climbing into their seats. Are you leaving? Millie asked, her eyes wide. Madelyn frowned. Why would I leave? I just got here. To be a cook, Mary said. Madelyn shook her head. The girls had obviously heard them talking. No, I'm not going anywhere. I love it here. I'm happy to be with you girls all the time. Do you want me to leave? They both shook their heads emphatically. Then it's settled. I'm going to stay. The girls looked relieved, and Madelyn looked at Bert. She hadn't realized the girls would be listening to everything they said. There was a knock on the door, and Bert frowned, getting up to go see who it was. Miss Hazel. Welcome. Hazel came into the house, smiling as she sniffed deeply. Maddie is a good cook, isn't she? Bert nodded. She is. We were just talking about how much we all enjoy her cooking. Madelyn looked at Miss Hazel. Would you like to stay for supper? I would love to. I just wanted to see how you were all getting along. Are the girls behaving for you? They are. They've been angels. Madelyn walked over to get down another bowl and a cup, which she filled with milk. She filled the bowl with the chicken and dumplings, and then carried one of the fresh loaves of bread and some butter to the table. We were just about to say grace. Don't let me stop you. Miss Hazel bowed her head expectantly. Bert gave Madelyn a look as if he wanted to know what the woman was doing there, but Madelyn just shrugged. She had no idea. She was pleased to see her, though. Bert said the prayer, and they all began to eat. This is delicious. I really am amazed at how well you cook, Madelyn. I love to cook. I think that helps. When you add love as your key ingredient to everything you make, it all turns out better. Well, then you need to keep adding love. Millie looked at Miss Hazel. Who are you? I'm Miss Hazel. I found your mama and brought her to you. Miss Hazel reached for a piece of bread and quickly buttered it. I taught all the other ladies how to cook, but your mama was already better than me. Are you taking her away with you? Millie asked. Madelyn shook her head at the little girl. I'm always going to be here with you. Don't worry that I'll go away, because I won't. My mama went away, Mary said softly. Madelyn looked at Bert, who looked very sad. I know she did, sweetheart, but she didn't want to go away. She wanted to stay with you forever. How do you know? Millie asked. Because I'm a mama now, and I know that I wouldn't leave you two for anything in the whole world. So I know your mama would have stayed with you forever if she could have. Bert nodded. She would have. Madelyn didn't know your first mama, but I did. She loved the two of you more than anything else in the whole wide world. And the baby in her tummy, Mary said. Yes, and the baby in her tummy. Millie frowned. The baby left, too. Bert wondered where this discussion was coming from. They hadn't asked a lot of questions about Sally's death, but now that Madelyn was here, they seemed to be obsessed with it. They both had to leave. They weren't well enough to keep living. He wasn't about to tell them God needed their mother more than they did. He'd heard people say that to their children many times, and it always bothered him. But this mama is well? Mary asked. I'm very well, and I'm staying here with you for as long as you'll let me. You might decide you don't want me around, and you'll kick me out. Madelyn said with a smile. No. We want you to stay forever and ever. Then that's what I'll do. Madelyn looked over at Miss Hazel, sad the conversation was happening with her there. Miss Hazel nodded. Your new mama won't come back to Ottawa with me. She's been talking about nothing but being your mama for 2 whole weeks. She wanted to come here more than anything. Why would she leave? The girls had no answer, and because of that, it looked like they believed. We like her, Millie said. Of course you do. Everyone likes your mama. Everyone? Millie asked. Everyone. Who else spends all their time cooking and cleaning with little girls? Isn't she fun? Millie nodded. She is. That's why we want to keep her. You have my permission. Miss Hazel said enthusiastically. Madelyn grinned at Bert, who was looking a bit befuddled by the entire conversation. I guess you're stuck with me, she said lightly. She wished she knew that he wanted her to stay as much as the girls did. He'd been very quiet through the conversation, though. I guess I am. I think the girls and I have decided to keep you. After supper, Miss Hazel helped her with the dishes. Was there a reason for your visit? Madelyn finally asked. Miss Hazel nodded. I was checking on everyone to make sure they were pleased with their matches. Not that anything can be done about it now, but I like to make sure my girls are happy. I see. I'm happy. I love the girls already. They're so sweet. And their father? Miss Hazel asked. Madelyn blushed, thankful that Bert was in the girls' room with them, getting them ready for bed and telling them a story. I think it could happen if I didn't watch myself. I'll be on my guard, though. Why? That's silly. You should love your husband. He's made it very clear he has no feelings for me, and he never will. He loved his first wife beyond belief, and I'm just a poor substitute. I don't think that's what he's trying to say to you. He isn't ready to lose his heart yet, but she's only been gone a short while. Give him a little time to get to know you better. Once he realizes just how much you and the girls love each other, and how much you love him, he won't be able to help himself. I hope you're right. Madelyn glanced out the window and saw that it was snowing. It's so beautiful here. I missed living in the country. Ottawa wasn't the place for someone like you. You're too sweet to be in a city. I don't know about that, but thank you for saying so. Madelyn handed the last dish to Miss Hazel, to dry and put away. We're done. Well, I'm glad I came by. I think your little family is going to do just fine. Miss Hazel reached for her coat and pulled it on. I'm going to go back to the hotel now. Remember to write. Won't I see you again? Madelyn was surprised by how strongly she felt about Miss Hazel. She'd become a second mother to her very quickly. How had that even happened? Probably not. I'll check on the others tomorrow and get on a train back to Ottawa the next day. It's time for me to go. Miss Hazel hugged Madelyn close. Some of the young ladies I work with become like daughters to me. You were one of those. Thank you for sharing your last 2 weeks with me. Thank you. Madelyn hugged her back. If you hadn't come along, I really don't know what I would have done. The situation was becoming unbearable. I could see that on your face when I was in your restaurant the day we met. I hope you never find yourself in that type of situation again. With those words, Miss Hazel opened the door and stepped out into the snowy night. Madelyn watched her go, a tear in her eye. She shouldn't miss her so much already, but she did. What kind of situation did she rescue you from? Bert asked, frowning at her. Chapter 5. Madelyn frowned at him for a moment. She didn't really want to discuss what had happened in Ottawa with Mr. Humphreys, but he was her husband. She owed him the truth, didn't she? She sighed, walking over to the table and sitting down in one of the chairs. I met Miss Hazel in the restaurant where I worked about 2 weeks ago. She could tell I was nervous about something, so she asked me if someone was bothering me. Bert frowned at her, walking over to sit down across from her. And? Was someone bothering you? She nodded. My manager had decided he was going to court me, and he really didn't care how I felt about it. He followed me home from work often. Sometimes he would be standing outside the boarding house where I lived, waiting for me when I came out. He tried to trap me in the back room to kiss me several times. He shook his head. Why didn't you go to the police? He didn't have the same kind of respect for Metropolitan Police that he had for Mounties, but they were better than nothing. And tell them what? My manager was overly friendly? She shrugged. I didn't know what to do. I hadn't really made any close friends there. The other waitresses didn't like me because they all knew I was Mr. Humphrey's favorite. The people in my house didn't like me because I was always followed around by a man twice my age. It was a strange situation, and I was very confused. Men like him should be flogged. Promise you'll tell me if anything like that happens to you again. She smiled a little, happy he was willing to defend her. Of course it was his job, but still, she was pleased. I'll let you know. Anyway, Miss Hazel wrote down her address and asked me to come see her. When I did, she showed me your letter. Until I read about the girls, I didn't think there was any way I could be a mail order bride. After reading about them, I didn't think I could stay away. She'd experienced what it was like to live with a step-parent firsthand, and she wasn't about to let the girls in his letter go through that. He smiled, reaching out and covering her hand with his without thinking first. I'm glad you came. The girls already love you. And I already love them. I've always been fascinated by twins. I'm a twin. My brother Ernest is a Mountie as well. Maybe I should give him Miss Hazel's address, so he can find himself a bride. She was very aware of where he was touching her. Yes, it was just her hand, but it was the most intimate she had ever been with a man. Are the two of you identical? He shook his head. No, Ernie is shorter than me, and his shoulders are much broader. He's not fat, but he's pure muscle. Compared to him, I look like a beanpole. He has the same black hair I have that won't lie down properly, though. I see. I look forward to meeting him someday. I think you'd like him. Ernie is a happy-go-lucky man, so unlike me. I'm more rigid in my thoughts and routines, but Ernie is fun-loving. Bert couldn't help thinking that she would have liked his brother a great deal more than him. I'm more serious myself. I'm glad you're the brother whose letter I answered and not him. Really? He'd always felt like he was a bit lacking with Ernie around. They'd gone through the academy together, and it was while he was on his first assignment that he'd met Sally. Every other girl he'd been interested in had fallen for his brother and not him. He couldn't help but be glad his brother wasn't there. Really? I've never been one to want to go out every night. I enjoy staying home and reading or working on a sewing project. My social life has always been dismal because I never wanted to leave my house. He smiled. I have this odd feeling we're going to get along very well. I rarely go out. If there's a community picnic or a parade or something, I always make sure the girls get to go, but I'm not a fan of having an active social life myself. At that moment, he realized he was holding her hand, and he pulled his away. I should be getting to bed soon. She nodded, understanding why he'd pulled his hand away, but not liking it. Do you want me to get ready first? He studied her for a moment, wondering how she felt about his mandate that there would never be feelings between them. He also wondered how he felt about it. It seemed like it should be a good thing, but it was bothering him all of a sudden. Why did he want to take his new wife in his arms and kiss her? Yes, you get ready first. I'll follow in a few minutes. He prayed she'd be asleep when he got there to join her. He wasn't certain he could handle it if she was awake and in bed when he was. Madelyn went behind the curtain and quickly changed into her nightgown before climbing into bed. She wasn't as tired as she'd been the night before, despite how hard she'd worked all day. She wasn't sure if she should feign sleep when he came in, or if she should talk to him. 10 minutes later, Bert came into the room and undressed in the dark. She heard the rustling sounds he made as he stripped off his clothes to prepare for bed. Then the bed dipped as he slipped under the covers beside her. She rolled to her side, facing him, one arm under her head atop the pillow. "This is strange." He sighed. "It is. I didn't think it would be odd at all, sharing a bed with a woman I barely knew. As long as we weren't touching each other, I thought it would be just fine. This is stranger, though. To me what's strange is that you're my husband, and you've never kissed me." "Not really. You kissed my cheek at the wedding, but that was the only time." She frowned, glad he couldn't see her face in the darkness. "It makes me feel as if there's something wrong with me." "What do you mean? You're a beautiful, attractive woman, Madelyn. No man in his right mind wouldn't want you to be his. But you don't seem to want me to be your wife. You just need someone to take care of the girls." "I thought that would be fine, and I wouldn't care, but I do care. I care a lot." He did, too. He wanted their marriage to be more than it was, but was that being faithful to Sally? He didn't respond for a moment, thinking hard about the right thing to say. "It's a lot harder than I thought it would be. I guess I was hoping that whoever became my bride wouldn't be attractive, and I'd have no problem at all keeping my hands off her. I have to say that's not the case. I want to touch you." He hated himself for it, but he wanted it more than he could express. He wasn't sure if he had feelings for her, or if it was just having a beautiful woman beside him. Somehow falling for her seemed more of a betrayal than touching her. Madelyn moved closer to him on the bed, not that there was much room to move. The bed wasn't terribly large to begin with. "Then touch me." Bert found he was fighting against himself. "I don't know if I can. Not without guilt. Think about it. Maybe we can both be thinking about exactly what we want from our marriage. I never expected to be attracted to you. I thought I could do exactly what you wanted and just be a mother to the girls. I'm thrilled with the girls. But I'm afraid I want more from their father. Give me a week to think on it, and we'll talk again. Will that work for you?" Madelyn nodded, a tear drifting down her cheek. She was glad he couldn't see it. She didn't want him to know he had that kind of power over her. "Yes, that will be fine." She rolled over, presenting her back to him, feeling very rejected. He still hadn't kissed her, and she'd all but begged him to. Bert knew she was hurting, but he didn't know what to do about it. He'd only met her yesterday, and Sally. Well, everything he'd ever loved was wrapped up in his sweet Sally. He'd think about it. Bert left for work on Saturday morning, making it clear he wasn't sure when he'd be home. Madelyn smiled as if she didn't care and as if she wasn't torn to pieces by their discussion the night before. Instead of dwelling on his rejection of her, she washed all the linens in the house and went to work on both bedrooms, the girls at her side. They were so excited to learn how to clean properly. She knew it wasn't that they wanted to clean. They wanted to be with her, and that felt good as well. After lunch, she put them down for their nap and carefully cut out the fabric she'd purchased to make them aprons. The dresses were more of a need, but she knew the girls would be more excited by the aprons, so that's what she'd make first. She was just picking up her needle and thread when the door opened, and Bert came in. "Something smells good." "Any lunch left?" he asked. She nodded, getting to her feet. "Sit down, and I'll get it for you." "Are you done with work for the day?" "Yes, for today. I won't work tomorrow either." He sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, stretching his feet out in front of him and crossing his hands behind his neck. "Are the girls napping?" "Yes, they were tired." She put the soup she'd made on the stove, heating it up. "I didn't know you were coming home so early, or I'd have kept this warm for you. I can wait a few minutes while you warm it. Doesn't hurt me at all." He leaned forward, his forearms on the table. "I forgot it was my turn to preach tomorrow. I'll have to spend the afternoon working on my sermon." "You're preaching? What about the pastor who married us?" "He was only here for the wedding. He's an itinerant preacher. Comes through here every couple of months. We 4 Mounties take turns other than that. We're not allowed to marry people, though, so we called him to come in for the weddings." "I see." She'd had no idea that part of a Mountie's job was to preach a Sunday sermon at times. "What will your sermon be about?" He shrugged. "I thought with all the new marriages this week, I should preach on marriage. So I'm going to talk about becoming one after the wedding." "I'll look forward to hearing that. Do the girls have Sunday dresses?" "No, they don't. We're pretty casual here. If you can have them wearing their best, that would be great. By next weekend, I'll be sure to have Sunday dresses for them to wear to church." "I'd appreciate that." He watched her cook, her movements efficient. She carried a bowl to him and put it on the table before him. "Thank you for reheating lunch for me." "It was no problem. I'm happy to do it." She sat back down and picked up the apron she was stitching. "I should have done new dresses for the girls first, but they both want aprons just like mine." I knew they'd be excited to get the aprons in a way a new dress wouldn't excite them. I'm sure they're going to be thrilled by anything their new mama makes for them. They idolize you, which surprises me after such a short time. He shook his head. "I'm glad, though. I want them to be happy with you. I think they're really worried I'm going away. Twice last night they got nervous because they heard us talking about things totally unrelated to my leaving, and they jumped to conclusions. I'm not sure how to make them feel more secure." It really bothered her how nervous they were about her leaving. She wanted them to feel content. "Just keep loving them. That's the only advice I have for you. Every time they wake up and find you here, they'll feel a little more secure. Every time they fall down and skin a knee, and you're here, they'll feel better about everything." "I hope so. I hate that they worry I'm just going to disappear." She tied off a knot and rethreaded her needle. "I want this transition to be as easy for them as it can possibly be." "You really love them, don't you?" He was surprised that someone who had never met his girls 2 days before could already care about them so much. "I loved them from the first instant I read your letter. I was ready to leave Miss Hazel's house, telling her there was no way I could ever marry a stranger, and then she put that letter in my hands. I know it's strange, but it felt as if I was drawn toward you right that instant, all 3 of you." She worried for a moment that he would think she was crazy, but she had to face facts. She'd gotten on a train with the intention of marrying a stranger. If that wasn't crazy, she didn't know what was. "I know you're exactly what we needed. I have to wonder what you're getting out of being here, other than getting away from your old manager, of course." "Well, I knew I wanted a family. People who would accept me for who I am. I wanted a place to belong. I have that with the 3 of you. I can cook what I want to cook, and be who I want to be. And you'll support me." He nodded. "That makes sense." He started to mention their discussion from the night before, but he still wasn't sure how he felt. He wanted to let her know that he was developing feelings for her as well, but would that get her hopes up? What if he couldn't make it work? She set down the apron. "I need to go bring in the linens off the line. I want to get our bed made up before the girls wake up to help. I made their bed earlier, and it took me 4 times as long as it would have taken to do it by myself." He grinned. "I'm sure it did, but they're good helpers, and all they want to do is please you. In 10 years, you'll be able to leave all the housework and the cooking to them, and you can sit back and watch." She shuddered at the thought. "I think I would go absolutely crazy if I was forced to be that idle. I'd much rather spend my time doing things than sitting around as if I was an invalid." She left, shutting the front door behind her. She had to remind herself that he didn't know her at all. Otherwise she'd have been offended by what he seemed to think she was looking for in life. At the line, she took down the sheets and the pillowcases, putting the clothespins into a bag hanging from the line. It was a very convenient setup, and she had to wonder if it had been his idea or Sally's. Either way, it made her job easier. Carrying in the linens, she took them straight to their curtained-off room and went to work making the bed. She was surprised when he came in and stood at the other side of the bed to help her. "Sally couldn't do it herself when she was carrying the girls, and I got into the habit of helping." She nodded. "I thank you for it. Making a bed is definitely easier with 2 sets of hands." She hadn't seen the tender side of him that he'd obviously shown his Sally. When it was finished, she plumped the pillows and looked down at it. She wanted to make a quilt for the bed, but she wasn't sure how he'd feel about that. Would it be all right if I made a quilt? After I finish with all the sewing for the girls. He looked down at the quilt on the bed, touching it for a moment. I think that's a good idea. We could put this one away for the girls when they're older. Their mother made it. I had a feeling that was the case. Madelyn didn't feel like she needed to wipe Sally's memory from everything in their cabin, but she knew the girls would want some things to remember their birth mother by. This would be a good memory for them. I'll start on one as soon as the immediate sewing is done. I have a couple of shirts that need to be mended. And some socks that need to be darned. He was afraid to add to her workload, but unlike Sally, she seemed to thrive on hard work. Sally had loved the girls, and she'd done everything she needed to do, but she had always seemed so tired from it. Not Madelyn. Sally had been the perfect wife for him, but looking at Madelyn, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd been right about that. Put them on the table when you leave for work on Monday morning, and I'll see to them. She'd already done most of the scrubbing that the little house needed. She'd wash the windows, and then it would just be a matter of keeping up, not trying to catch up. Then there would be a lot more time for her to do sewing and other projects with the girls. Thank you for being willing to do them. It's my job as your wife and the girls' mother. I know why I'm here. Madelyn started to walk past him, but he caught her arm. Yes? That is why I sent for you. I think I made it clear in the letter. He hated that she was hurting, but he didn't know how to change it. She nodded. Yes, you did. And I will fulfill my end of the bargain. She pulled away and walked back into the main room, sitting at the table and getting back to work. All the while she did, she thought about what it would be like for her husband to be in love with her. Chapter 6. Going to the church service on Sunday morning and listening to her husband preach was very odd for Madelyn. He preached about the ideal marriage and each person's place in that marriage. She thought for a moment that he wasn't fulfilling his role as a husband, but then she dismissed the thought as unfair. Millie sat snuggled into her right side, and Mary snuggled into her left. She saw all of the women who had traveled to White Fox with her and married the other Mounties. She looked around at them, wondering how their new marriages were going, saying a silent prayer for each of them. Colleen sat with her back straight, almost too straight to Madelyn's way of thinking, beside her new husband, Marshall. Ida had Lily on one side of her and Andrew on the other. Callie still seemed to have a confused look on her face, as if she was trying to figure out how she'd ended up in Manitoba with Peter. All the men wore their dress uniforms and looked handsome, but none of the others looked nearly as handsome as Herbert, who stood in front of them all with his Bible in his hands. After the service, Madelyn walked over to Ida, feeling closer to her than any of the others since they had both been at Miss Hazel's before the others arrived. She carefully held the girl's hands in hers as she walked to her friend. Ida, I want you to meet my new daughters. This is Millie, she said, nodding to the girl on her right, and this is Mary. Ida smiled at them. It's so nice to meet you. I hope you'll be friends with Lily. Millie nodded. We would love to be her friends. She smiled at Lily and received a shy smile in return. How's marriage treating you? Madelyn asked, silently praying that her friend wouldn't ask her the same question. She really didn't want to discuss how much in love she already was with a man who didn't have any feelings for her at all. Ida shrugged. It's a learning experience. Marrying a stranger is not something I ever thought I'd do. I know exactly what you mean. At least I got 2 beautiful new daughters out of it. They were joined by Callie and Colleen, and the 4 of them talked for a few minutes. When Bert came over to join her, she smiled at him. I packed a picnic lunch for us. It's in the cabin. He shrugged. That sounds nice. He took Millie's hand to free one of hers and offered her his arm. With a wave, she smiled at her friends and left the church with her new family. I thought it would be nice to do something outdoors while the weather holds. It looks like it might snow again any time, but it's beautiful today. It is. She felt odd holding onto his arm as if their marriage was a normal one, but she didn't say anything. She was just pleased he was at least making an effort in public. At their house, he took the picnic basket, and she carried the quilt. The girls danced around them, excited at the prospect of a picnic. "We haven't had a picnic since our other mama died," Millie said, obviously very excited. Her voice didn't hold the usual sadness it did when she spoke of her other mama. "Well, it's about time then, isn't it?" Mary nodded solemnly. "We haven't had a picnic since we moved here," Madelyn frowned. "That's very sad. Little girls should have picnics and tea parties every day." She made a promise to herself that she would invite Ida and Lily over for a tea party that week. It would be a lovely way for the girls to get to know one another better. They walked outside of town, down toward a bubbling brook, and she spread the quilt out on the ground. She hoped it wasn't a special one, but she didn't know. How could she? The grass was still looking beaten down by the snow that had recently melted, but she could see some sprigs of green that made her think spring might be on its way. Once she had served everyone, Bert said grace. After the prayer, he smiled at her. "Thank you for planning a picnic. The girls are very happy to be doing things that seem normal again." She smiled. "I'm happy to do as many things like this as we possibly can. I think little girls' lives should be filled with picnics and tea parties." "Was your childhood filled with picnics and tea parties?" he asked, a smile on his face. She shook her head. "No, my mother remarried when I was about the girl's age. After that, my life was filled with helping out around the house because Mom was always expecting. She wanted to give her girls the kind of upbringing she hadn't had." "That's not fair." "Do you have younger sisters?" he asked. "3 of them." "Did they get picnics and tea parties?" "Every week. My stepfather wanted them to have perfect childhoods." She took a bite of potato salad and smiled. "I really like how it turned out this time. I experimented with a new recipe." He took the hint that she didn't want to talk about her childhood any longer. "I like it, too. But I haven't taken a single bite that you've cooked that didn't make my taste buds jump for joy. You are truly an amazing cook, Maddie." She was a little startled at his use of her nickname, but then she realized she liked it. It had only been used by Miss Hazel since she'd left home, and it felt good to hear it on his lips. "I'm glad you enjoy my cooking. If you think about it, all the years I've spent learning to cook have been for you and the girls." He smiled at that. "I guess I never thought of it that way." When they had finished their picnic, she gathered up their dirty dishes and put them back in the basket she'd found. She couldn't help but wonder how many picnics he'd gone on with Sally, using the same basket. "I brought a ball if you girls would like to play catch." Millie took the ball, and she and Mary went a short distance away and began throwing it back and forth. "I love to watch them play together. It must be a twin thing how well they seem to communicate without saying anything at all." Madelyn pulled out some cookies she'd made while the rest of the household slept that morning, sharing one with Bert. "My brother and I were the same. Sometimes we would feel like we knew exactly what the other one was thinking 90% of the time. And then something would happen to make us wonder if we even knew each other. It was strange." He accepted the cookie and bit into it, closing his eyes. "You truly have a gift in the kitchen." She smiled. "I'm glad you think so." As she watched, Millie fell and started to cry. Madelyn was on her feet running toward her before Bert had registered what the sound was. "Where does it hurt?" she asked, stroking the girl's arm. "There." Millie pointed to her ankle, and Madelyn felt along it, trying to see if anything appeared off. "I think it's going to be okay. Let's see if you can walk." Madelyn helped Millie to her feet. Millie took a few steps. "It doesn't hurt anymore." "You fixed it, Mama." Millie threw herself at Madelyn, wrapping her arms around her neck. Madelyn smiled. "I don't know if I fixed it or it wasn't hurt badly to start with." She held the little girl close, amazed at how good it felt to have the small arms around her. "Do you want to come sit on the quilt with Daddy and me? Or do you want to play more?" "I'll play." Millie hurried away, picking up the ball and throwing it to her sister again. It was only then that Madelyn realized Bert had followed her over. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." Bert shook his head. "You handled it beautifully." He held his hand down to help her up from the ground. "You were born to be a mother, Maddie." She smiled. "Thank you. I feel as if I was, but it's so nice to hear you say it." He kept her hand in his as he walked back toward the quilt, sitting back down. "Are you happy here?" "Mostly. Happier than I've ever been." If she could just know that he was returning her feelings, it would help a great deal. "The girls are obedient to you when I'm not around?" She nodded. "So obedient it worries me at times. It makes me think they are worried if they make a wrong move, I'll go away." He sighed. "I hope they get over that soon. I had no idea how traumatic this would all be for them. I guess I'd been so worried about my own emotions, I neglected to think about theirs." She wanted to ask if he'd come to any conclusions about his emotions, but she'd promised him a week. It hadn't even been 2 days yet. She would have to wait. "I think they're going to be all right. We just need to make sure that we keep showering them with love." He looked down at her for a moment. She loved his children every bit as much as he did. It shone from her eyes as she looked at them. He didn't want to fall for her, but he wasn't sure he could hold out. If the girls had been just a duty for her, maybe he could have. But they weren't, and it was obvious in her every action. Their eyes met, and she felt a tingle run through her body. She wanted to be held in his arms, and kept there forever. Her heart beat faster, and she wanted to tear her gaze away, but she couldn't. She felt as if she was drowning in his big brown eyes. He leaned down and brushed his lips against hers, feeling as if he was under a spell cast by her eyes. The kiss was brief, but his entire body reacted as if he'd been struck by lightning. Even Sally had never made him feel this way. When he raised his head, he stroked her cheek. "I don't know what you've done to me, Maddie, but I fear I'll never be the same again." With those words, he got up and walked beside the stream, obviously lost in thought. Madelyn watched him go, her fingers on her lips. They still burned where he'd touched them. What was he thinking now? Any other man would have asked her to walk with him, but Bert walked off alone. She took deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. Soon, she hoped he would be able to kiss her without being racked with guilt. The girls finished playing with the ball and hurried over, each of them reaching for a cookie. "Did you have fun?" Madelyn asked softly. Millie nodded. "We like to play with the ball." "I'm glad. You girls should play with the ball while I'm hanging laundry on the line next time." Mary shook her head adamantly. "No, we help." Madelyn smiled. "You're good helpers. What would I do without the two of you?" Bert was back a few minutes later, and he held his hand down to help Madelyn up, and then he picked up the picnic basket. "Let's get back to the cabin. I'm sure we all have things we should be doing, and I know 2 little girls who are overdue for a nap." "But, Daddy, I'm not sleepy," Millie protested, rubbing her eyes. Madelyn couldn't help but grin as the tired little girl protested. "I'll make you a deal. If you lie down with your eyes closed for 10 minutes, and you're not asleep after that, you can get up." Millie nodded emphatically. "I can stay awake." Bert's eyes met Madelyn's, his full of laughter. "I think that's a very smart deal. Then if they're not really tired, they can get back up." He obviously knew the same thing she did. They'd never make it more than a minute without falling asleep. He sat with her that afternoon while she finished the girls' aprons. She had carefully embroidered each girl's name on her apron, so they could start to distinguish their own names. He worked on whittling a doll head while she sewed, and they talked softly of the girls' future, but never their own, as they worked. She desperately wanted to talk to him about the things that were important to her, but she knew he wasn't ready. "I have overnight rounds to make tomorrow night. The other men have been covering for me since Sally died, but it's time I took my own rounds back from them. It's not fair for them to keep doing my work forever." Bert watched her carefully as he told her this. Madelyn looked up from the dresses she was cutting out. "All right. How long will you be gone?" "At least tomorrow night, and maybe Tuesday night as well." In a way, she was pleased he'd be gone, because fighting her feelings for him with him right there was hard. But she knew she and the girls would miss him a great deal. "I'll pray for your safety." He smiled at that, thankful she was the woman who was sent to be his wife. "Thank you. I appreciate that. Will you go with one of the other men? Or will you be alone out there?" "I'll be alone. Sometimes Andrew goes with me, but I don't think he will this week. I'll be fine on my own. I've done this once or twice before." She nodded. "I'm sure you have. I'll take good care of the girls." "I know you will." "I appreciate that very much." His eyes met hers again, and he remembered what her lips had felt like under his. How she'd tasted. He had a lot of thinking to do while he was gone, and most of it was about his pretty new bride. "I'd better start supper," she finally said, tearing her gaze from his. Why was she so attracted to this man? What was it about him that made him so much more special in her eyes than any other? She stood and started a casserole for supper, trying to force herself to breathe normally. The man she'd married was filling her every thought. Hopefully he'd make a decision about her soon, or she'd slowly go out of her mind. Once the girls were in bed that night, she started sewing their dresses, while he continued his whittling work. "I'll be riding out at daybreak tomorrow. Do you think you could pack me enough food for a couple of days?" She nodded. "I'd be happy to. I'll get up early and fix you a nice breakfast and put some food together for you." She was so happy to do anything he asked of her. Maybe if she was indispensable to him, he'd love her. It was worth a try. She was again awake when he went to bed, but she said nothing, staring at the wall on her side of the bed. She could just make it out by the trickle of moonlight coming in through the window. When he was certain she was asleep, Bert scooted toward her in the bed, wrapping his arm around her waist, his back pressed against her. He needed to be able to feel her against him. Madelyn was surprised at his gesture, but she melted back against him, loving the feel of his body against hers. Maybe his mind didn't want to love her, but it seemed his body did. She'd have to accept that. For now. She closed her eyes and dreamed of him. Of the girls as she showed them their baby brother. Of tea parties and picnics. He laid awake all night, just holding her close. He'd lost his heart and had it broken when his first wife died. He wasn't sure he could go through that again. Chapter 7. Madelyn woke early to get Bert's meals ready for his time away. It was before 3 when she started her baking for the day, and she promised herself she'd nap when the girls did. But for now, it was her job to take care of her husband. He came into the kitchen not long before sunup, yawning behind his hand. "How did you sleep?" She shrugged. "Fitfully, but I did sleep some." She'd had his leaving on her mind, and she really didn't want him to go. "How about you?" He had dark circles under his eyes, and she was afraid she already knew the answer. "Not well, but it's all right. I'm used to it." He had barely slept at all for a month after Sally died. How could he? He was the sole parent of 2 beautiful little girls, and he couldn't think of anything but how he had to be everything to those 2 children. She scooped eggs out of the frying pan and added them to the bacon already on 2 plates. Putting the plates on the table, she poured them each a cup of coffee. "I've got bread in the oven that will be ready before you leave. Thank you for getting up so early to take care of me. I really do appreciate it." She nodded once, trying to fight back tears. She couldn't believe how sad she was at the thought of him being gone overnight. She'd only known him a few days. There had to be something wrong with her. "Be careful." He looked at her with a frown. "Are you worried about me?" "Of course I am. You're my husband." She ate the last bite of her eggs, before standing to get the bread from the oven. She dumped the loaf pan over and cut it into pieces. She'd make more later, for the girls and herself, but this loaf was for him. She wrapped it up in cheesecloth along with some extra bacon she'd made for sandwiches along the way. She filled a thermos with coffee for him, so he'd have something warm to drink. She put it all into a cloth bag she'd found and set it on the table. "There. That should get you through." He wiped off his mouth and stood, walking around the table and grasping her upper arms. "Take care of my girls for me." With those words, he lowered his mouth to hers, kissing her sweetly. His arms wrapped around her, and she clung to his shoulders. When he finally lifted his head, he looked into her eyes. "I'll be home as soon as I can." He picked up his bag of food and left the cabin, and she stood leaning against the counter, staring after him. It wasn't until she knew he was gone that she allowed the tears to fall. She sat down at the table and put her head on her arms and wept. She wanted him to be safe, but she wanted him to do his job. Most importantly, she wanted him to be there with her and the girls. During his absence, she kept herself busy. She and the girls walked over to Ida's house right after the girls finished their breakfast. Ida came to the door, and Madelyn smiled. "I was hoping you and Lily would come over for tea today." Ida nodded, a huge smile on her face. "We'd love to. Lily was just saying she's ready to make friends here." "Then come over around 3, and we'll make it happen." "Can I bring anything?" Ida asked. Madelyn shook her head. "No, the girls and I have it covered. I'm going to make some cookies and some tea." Lily smiled at Madelyn from behind her mother's back. "I like cookies." "Me too." Madelyn waved her hand. "We'll see you at 3. Madelyn stopped in at the Mercantile on her way back. She wanted to get everything she would need for the baking she planned to do. While she was there, she picked up a few more yards of a fabric she thought would look good on the girls. She needed something to occupy her mind during the long hours Bert worked. When they got home, she mixed up cookie dough, giving each of the girls a small portion to play with. She needed them to stay occupied. After lunch, while the girls slept, she stitched as fast as she could on their new dresses, wanting them to be done by the time Bert arrived home. She wanted to surprise him, and she couldn't think of anything else. Just before 3, she woke the twins and brushed their hair, making sure they knew how to be good hostesses. "I don't want you to mention that Lily's lip looks different, all right?" She wasn't sure if the little girl was still sensitive about her appearance, but she knew that she might be. After getting an agreement from both girls, she put the kettle on for tea, and arranged the cookies nicely on a plate. She set out pretty plates for all 5 of them, and waited for their guests. They didn't have to wait long. There was a knock on the door at precisely 3. Madelyn hurried to open it and invite their friends in, and they all sat around the table, eating the cookies. Madelyn gave the girls mostly milk and a little bit of tea each. She and Ida had mostly tea with a bit of milk. All of them ate the cookies, and they had a nice conversation. Lily was a little older than her girls, but she didn't seem to mind playing with children younger than she was. She seemed quite happy to have someone to play with for a change. "How does she like White Fox?" Madelyn asked when the girls had gone off to play on their own for a little while. "She's shy, so she hasn't really made any friends yet. She will soon, I hope." Ida looked toward the girls' bedroom where they played. "I think she's afraid the other children will see her scar and make fun of her, so she closes herself off." "Your girls are her first friends here." "Well, I'm glad they're her friends. I warned them not to mention the scar, hoping that would help." Ida smiled. "Thank you for inviting us over for tea. It was really lovely, and it was nice for us to be able to get out of the house and do something fun." Madelyn shrugged. "I'm just glad to have someone to talk to for a while." Bert left to do some overnight rounds. He said he'd be gone at least one night and possibly 2. "I wasn't sure if I could keep myself from fretting if I was just here with the girls all day and night." "Well, I'm around if you need me. I'm happy to bring my sewing over tomorrow if it would help you make it through the day easier." "That would be wonderful, if you don't mind. The girls could play while we work." "Sounds good to me. I think Lily is having a good time with the girls, and I know I'll enjoy your company while we sew." Ida glanced at the clock. "We need to go now, though. I have to fix supper." "All right. Thank you so much for coming over. What time should we expect you tomorrow?" "Why don't we say around 10? That'll give me a couple of hours to sew with you before lunchtime." "You could stay for lunch, if you'd like," Madelyn offered. Thank you. I appreciate the offer. We might do that. It depends whether or not Andrew is coming home for lunch. Ida got to her feet and called Lily. Lily came running. Yes? It's time for us to go. Lily looked disappointed, but she immediately turned to Madelyn and said, "Thank you for inviting us. I had a lovely time." "Thank you so much for coming, Lily. The girls enjoyed themselves playing with you." Madelyn grinned at Ida. "We'll see you in the morning?" "Absolutely. Lily will enjoy playing again, and maybe I'll be able to concentrate on my sewing." After they'd left, Madelyn made supper. She decided to do something simple, since it was just the three of them, and she made some French toast. After supper, she sat with the girls and told them stories she'd read. After putting them to bed, she sat at the table and did more sewing by lamplight. It was a lot harder to sew without the natural light from the sun, but she managed. If she'd been in town, she could have flipped a switch to turn the electric lights on, but here in the country, they used lantern light. She went to bed much later than usual, not sure she'd be able to sleep with Bert gone. It was surprising how used to having him beside her she'd become. After lunch on Tuesday, Bert started for home, excited to see his children, but surprisingly even more excited to see Madelyn. She'd already gotten under his skin in just the few days she'd been there, and he still wasn't sure what to do about it. He was halfway back to town when it started snowing, and it wasn't a light snow. It was a full-fledged blizzard, and he hadn't seen it coming. He wasn't sure if it was because he'd been thinking about his new wife and ignoring the signs, or if there had been no signs. Either way, he was going to have to find shelter, and fast. He remembered a farmhouse he'd passed just a quarter of a mile back. He knew the couple who lived there, both older with grown children. He was sure they'd let him sit out the storm. He would just have to wait a little longer before seeing the girls and his sweet wife. Madelyn was positively gleeful as she put the girls down for their nap on Tuesday. She hoped that Bert had been right about making it home that night. She only had to hem the girls' dresses, and they'd be ready to wear for him. She finished the dresses, noticing that it was getting very dark in the cabin. She rushed over to the window to see that it was snowing hard. She frowned, not wanting Bert to get stuck out in it. Instead of fretting, she went to the stove and started the fried chicken she'd planned for his homecoming. Hopefully the storm wouldn't delay him too much. She served supper at 6 as he'd told her she needed to do, and the girls ate it greedily. They were halfway through the meal when Millie asked, "Where's Daddy?" "I'm sure he stopped somewhere to take shelter from the storm," Madelyn told her. "He's all right?" Madelyn nodded, pasting a smile on her face and praying she wasn't lying to the girl. He had to be all right. That's all there was to it. She couldn't raise these girls on her own, but more importantly, her heart would simply break if anything happened to him. He still wasn't home when it was time for bed, but then the storm was still going strong. She took to their bed exhausted, wishing he were there. Waking early on Wednesday morning, she immediately went to the window, checking to see if the storm had stopped. When she saw that it was still going, she sighed. He probably wouldn't be home for another day or two. She could handle it. There was plenty of firewood, and there was food to spare. They'd be just fine. It was Friday morning before the snow stopped finally, and she was beside herself with worry. There were snow drifts almost as high as the roof on one side of the cabin. Andrew came by that morning to check on her and the girls. "Has Bert been in touch?" he asked her. Madelyn shook her head. "I haven't seen him since just before dawn on Monday morning." She wanted to ask if he thought her husband was all right, but she just couldn't get the words out. Her throat was almost closed with fear. "I'm sure he stopped somewhere to take shelter. He'll be back soon." His voice sounding very convincing, but his face. Well, his face looked as worried as she felt. "I'll have him come see you if I see him first. I'd appreciate it if you'd do the same." "Absolutely. You need to stop worrying, though, because he's going to be just fine. He's new to this area, but he isn't new to being a Mountie. He's very good in a crisis. You'll see." Madelyn smiled. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" Andrew shook his head. "No, After a storm like this, there's a lot to do around town. I need to get to work. He tipped his hat to her and hurried away. She turned to go and make coffee, planning to have some on at all times until Bert arrived home. She knew he'd need something warm when he got back. All of her sewing projects were finished on Saturday afternoon, when Bert finally walked in the door. She had been mixing up a cake for supper when she heard the door open, and she dropped her spoon and ran toward the door, throwing herself into his arms. I was so worried. Bert closed his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. I was fine. I holed up with the Andersons outside of town. They have a couple of spare rooms, and I was close to there when the snow started. I thought it would be smarter to stay there than to try to make it home. She took a deep breath, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. Why would she cry now when she knew everything was all right? That made no sense at all. I'm just glad you're safe now. The girls have missed you. He pulled away a bit and tilted her face up to him. How about you? Have you missed me? She nodded emphatically. More than I should have. I was so scared. Well, I'm here now. And I'm starving. She laughed. Didn't Mrs. Anderson feed you? Sure she did, but nothing tastes as good as one of your meals. I can fix something, or we have some leftover meatloaf and mashed potatoes in the icebox. I could heat that up for you. Sounds wonderful, thank you. He stripped off his heavy coat and removed his gloves. I really am sorry that I worried you. It wasn't your fault. But don't do it again. She grinned at him as she got the food from the icebox and put it on the stove to heat. Have you seen Andrew yet? He was by yesterday morning looking for you. He looked as worried as I felt. I'll go talk to him as soon as I've got some food in me. It took me 3 times as long as it should have to get home because the snow was so deep. I can run over and tell them you're all right while you eat. No need, I'll do it when I'm done. That'll be soon enough. Most likely the livery has already told him that I dropped my horse off there, and he'll be here to make sure I'm not hurt. He was right. He'd just taken his first bite when a knock sounded at the door. Madelyn hurried over. He's home and safe. He was going to come see you as soon as he finished eating, she told Andrew. Andrew grinned. I figured it was something like that. May I come in? Madelyn opened the door wide. Are you hungry? I just made Bert something to eat. No, ma'am, I'm just fine. He walked to the table and sat down across from Bert. Glad you're all right. I'm doing just fine. Do you want some coffee? Bert asked. He wasn't about to stop shoveling the food into his mouth, so he needed to at least offer his friend something to drink. No thanks. I just came from home when I heard you were back in town. You get caught in it? Bert shrugged. As soon as the first flakes of snow hit, it was blowing hard, so I turned around and went back to the Andersons. I wasn't much past their farm, and I knew they'd put me up until it was over. I almost missed the house with as heavy as the snow was, but I happened to see a light from their window. Thank God you did. You'd have been lost in it otherwise. Madelyn turned her back on the men at those words. She didn't like hearing how close she'd come to losing her husband, and the men talked about it as if it was an everyday occurrence. She was happy when the girls came out, so she had something to concentrate on. Daddy's home? Millie asked, running to her father. You were gone a long time. Bert reached down to lift his little girl onto his lap, but he kept eating. Madelyn caught Mary before she went over, carrying her to the table, and putting her on her own lap. I'm sorry I was gone so long. There was a very bad storm, so I stayed with a nice couple who live outside town. Andrew stood up. Well, I'm going to let you eat and spend some time with your family. I'll let the others know you're safe. We were giving you until Monday, and we were going to send out a search party. Glad you didn't have to do that. Bert didn't stand, but he offered his hand to his friend to shake. Thanks for checking on me, you're very welcome. With that, Andrew was gone, leaving Bert there with his family. Bert looked at Madelyn. I know you've had a rough week, and it looks like you haven't slept much. Do you want to take a nap, and I'll watch the girls? She thought about it for a moment before shaking her head. No, thank you. She was tired, but she was so happy he was there, she didn't want to miss even a moment of his homecoming. What would you like for supper tonight? He polished off the last of his lunch and leaned back in his chair. I don't even care as long as you cook it. Is that a cake you were working on? Madelyn laughed. You're always hungry. Yes, it's a cake. We'll have it for dessert. He sighed happily. It sure is nice to come home to someone who is ready to take care of me. I always will be. Chapter 8. Most of the snow had melted by the time they went to church on Sunday. When the twins went out to see Bert in their pretty new dresses, he smiled at them and praised them for their beauty, but the whole while he was looking at his amazing new wife who had used his absence to accomplish tasks she'd set before herself. When it was time to leave, he offered her his arm, realizing they still hadn't had the talk she wanted, and it had been longer than he'd said. He'd still not come to any conclusions about where he wanted to go though, so hopefully she'd give him just a little bit longer. When they reached the church, both girls hurried over to play with their new friend, Lily, and Madelyn smiled, pleased they had found someone they liked. Her eyes caught Ida's, and her friend nodded at her, obviously pleased as well. A few other children joined them at the back of the church. Since Bert wasn't preaching this time, he led her around the church, introducing her to different people. After the services, they invited Ida, Andrew, and Lily to have Sunday lunch with them, and the girls were all happy to be together for a little longer. As they left the church, Madelyn caught sight of a bison, standing across the road and staring at them. Look, she said, pointing toward the beast. You haven't seen Chip before? Ida asked, obviously surprised. Chip? He has a name? As she asked it, she slipped a little bit. Looking down at her shoe, she saw she'd obviously stepped in one of Chip's namesakes. A buffalo chip. She wrinkled her nose, but kept walking, trying to rub it off as they went. Ida giggled. I see you understand now. Unfortunately. Madelyn shook her head. Who named him Chip? No idea. I just know that's what they call him, so I call him that, too. He doesn't come when called or anything, but we couldn't expect him to. He's not a dog after all. Madelyn had left a pot of stew on the stove while they were at church. A loaf of bread was ready to stick into the oven. I'm just going to bake this bread, and as soon as it's done, we'll have stew with fresh, hot bread. The girls immediately ran into the twins' area of the cabin, and Madelyn put the bread in the oven, checked on the stew, and set the table. How can I help you? Ida asked. I don't need any help. Just sit. A moment later, Madelyn sat with her friend. I hope you don't mind waiting a few more minutes for lunch. The bread will be done in about 30 minutes. That sounds good. The two women sat and talked softly about being mothers, and so many other things that only women talk about. Madelyn wanted to confide in her friend about how things were going with Bert, but she wasn't certain whether or not that would be disloyal to her new husband. Are you happy? Madelyn finally asked. Ida shrugged. I don't know. I think I could be. We'll see how things go from here. I'm happy that Lily seems to be adjusting well to the new situation. She studied Madelyn. What about you? Madelyn shrugged. I love the girls. They couldn't behave better. I'm very impressed by their manners. Her eyes drifted over to her husband, and she saw him watching her. She lowered her voice even more. I just wish their father was as happy to have me here as his girls are. He seems to really like you. You don't think he does? He's still in love with Sally, the girl's mother. She died 4 months ago, and he can't get her out of his head. I feel like every time he looks at me, he's thinking of her. Do you want me to ask Andrew what she was like? Would that help at all? I don't know. Maybe. I just don't want him to know it came from me. Madelyn shook her head, sitting up straighter. I don't want you to. I feel like that would be playing schoolgirl games, and I'm a wife and a mother now. I can stand on my own 2 feet, thank you very much. Ida smiled, nodding. I know just how you feel. All right. Do you mind if I say a little prayer that things work out well for the two of you? That would make me very happy. Madelyn stood and took the bread out of the oven, calling everyone to come and eat. After their prayer, Andrew took one bite of her stew and closed his eyes. I've been hearing about your cooking, but you're better than I thought. Ida nodded. I told you she was an amazing cook. Andrew nodded. You can say that again. I told you she was a good cook. Ida said with a grin. Bert smiled as the girls ate with their friend. They all chattered together, keeping the conversation lively. I'm really glad the three of them are hitting it off so well. The girls need friends other than just each other. But they'll be forever friends, Madelyn added. I wish I had a twin to be my forever friend. Maybe. Twins can overshadow you as well. Ernie made me feel like I was almost nothing, Bert said, taking a bite of his stew. It was strange how easily he could make me feel badly, when someone else could do the same thing and it would never bother me. Ernie was just larger than life at times. I didn't know you were a twin, Andrew said, frowning at him. What does your brother do? He's a Mountie. Bert said nothing else, letting his friend infer what he would. Who decided to join the force first? I did. I always wanted to be a Mountie from the time we were boys. We joined together, went through the academy together. Just like we'd done everything else together our entire lives. Madelyn stood up, trying to take the attention away from Bert. She could see he didn't like the conversation they were having. I made a cake. Who's ready for dessert? Bert smiled at her, obviously pleased by her change of subject. I would love a piece. All the girls asked for one as well. Madelyn rushed away to come back with clean plates with the cake on them. Ida jumped up to help her, whispering to her, Bert doesn't seem to be thrilled to be a twin. I don't think he is. Madelyn shrugged. I can understand what he's saying, though. I think I can, too. Ida carried the plates of cake to the table while Madelyn cut more. After the cake was eaten, the two ladies did the dishes together while the men talked and the children played. Madelyn was thrilled to have more time with her friend. It surprised her just how connected she felt with Ida, especially now that she was a mother as well. The other family stayed until it was time to start supper. Madelyn made the fried chicken she'd planned for Bert's homecoming, complete with mashed potatoes, gravy, and green beans. Bert watched her move around the kitchen, his mind on the talk they'd had, and what he planned to say to her once the children were in bed. He knew he had to give her some sort of answer. It wasn't fair to keep her in limbo the way he had. After the girls were in bed for the night, he sat down at the table with her. I think I've come to an answer to your question for me. She thought for a moment about pretending to not know what the question was, but she decided that was beneath her. She wanted a little extra time before the inevitable, but she also knew this whole discussion was difficult for him. What's the answer? She asked. I want to court you. I think we should take the normal time a couple would have before marriage and get to know one another better. We will decide after that what kind of marriage we should have. It may stay just like it is depending on how we feel about each other at the end of our courtship. We may decide to court a little longer. We may decide that we want a real marriage. What kind of time frame are you thinking about? She asked. It sounded to her as if she'd still be in a state of not knowing where the future would take her. She needed to get out of the position of uncertainty she was in. He shrugged. I was thinking just a week or so? Unless we decide we need longer. And how do you propose we have a courtship with two small children? That was her real question. How could they possibly court with Millie and Mary around? Would Ida be willing to watch them? We can go for drives with the girls, or we can do things without them. I'm all right either way. We also have time after they're in bed every night. He covered her hand with his. Will you let me court you, Maddie? It seems odd to be courted by my husband, but yes, you may court me. We'll see how things go. She hated that she was still uncertain about what her future would hold, but at least they were making an effort to decide things. He smiled. Good. It will let us know if we're a good match. He looked around the small cabin. If we were courting, I'd take you for a walk. But with children in bed, we could walk around the outside of the house a few times and just chat. Of course the ground is muddy from the recent snow melt. There's a bench outside and back. We could sit there, and if one of the girls cries, we'd hear her. Brilliant idea. He stood and offered her his arm, still feeling a pang of guilt every time they touched. How would his Sally feel about him courting another woman? She smiled and took his arm, walking with him out the door and around to the bench. It was hard to believe there'd been such a hard snowfall only days before, because it was lovely outside tonight. She was a bit chilly, but didn't want to go back inside for a shawl. They sat down, and she looked at him. Do you enjoy reading? I do. It's always been one of my favorite things. I particularly like the works of Dickens and Twain. I really enjoy Louisa May Alcott, and there's a new author I've just read one book by that I believe will be a favorite. She's a Canadian woman, and she's written a beautiful story about a young orphan girl named Anne. I hope to introduce the story to our girls when they're a little older. He loved the way she said our girls, as if she truly did believe they were hers as much as his. What's the name of the book? Perhaps I've heard of it. Anne of Green Gables. If you'd like to read it, I have a copy inside. I couldn't leave it behind. I find that book helps me feel connected to others. I don't know why. It just does. I believe I'd enjoy that. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, experiencing the buildup of the physical feelings that she always brought about. If you could live anywhere in the world, where would you go and why? She smiled at that. I'd want to live here, of course, because it's where you and the girls are. She settled against him, feeling the zing of electricity rushing through her veins. What about you? Where would you want to live and why? I'm not sure. I've always wanted to see new places, but I've always wanted to be settled down, too. I love being here with my girls. I guess for me, home is wherever they are. Well, we're boring, aren't we? Let me ask a different, related question. If you could travel to anywhere in the whole world, where would you go? That is different, but let's be more imaginative. Let me think. He was silent for a moment as he thought about all the places in the world he'd read about and would be interested in visiting. I think Russia. It's supposed to be the most similar to Canada in climate. That could be very interesting. What about you? He asked. She tilted her head to one side, thinking hard. I think maybe I'd want to go to the Caribbean. I've heard the ocean is clear and beautiful there. I would love to see it. Not that she'd ever seen the ocean to have anything to compare it to. She'd rarely left her hometown until she moved to Ottawa. Well, I don't guess we'd be going to our first choices together then. Why not? We'd go on a trip to Russia, but we'd go in a boat, and we'd just ask the captain to sail around the tip of South America on the way back. Because that's not out of the way at all, he said. I like the way you think, though. I'm just trying to be practical. She hid a yawn behind her hand. She didn't want their time together to end, but mornings came very early. At her yawn, he sighed. I guess we should pause this courtship for a moment and go to bed. He nudged her in the side. You go first, I'll be in shortly. He wasn't ready for their time to be over that night, but she would be home alone with the children all the next day. She needed her rest even more than he did. Once she was in bed, she laid awake waiting for him, hoping he would hold her as she went to sleep as he'd done another time, when he hadn't realized she was awake. Was that so much to ask? Bert went behind the curtain and quickly stripped, wondering if she was asleep. He climbed into bed beside her, his hand touching her shoulder. She rolled toward him, settling her head on his chest while he lay with his arm around her. He kissed her forehead. Good night, Maddie. Good night, Bert. And she realized it was a good night. She had him beside her, and he was at least willing to try to make their marriage a real one. How could she ask for anything else? Chapter 9. For Bert, the following day was one of patrolling the area with his friends, trying to make certain everyone had made it through the storm all right. He and Andrew rode to the west and the south, and Marshall and Peter went to the east and the north. They all knew they would be out very late, if not overnight, and they'd warned their wives. Hopefully they could be back before nightfall. They all had new brides, and being gone overnight was hard on them. Madelyn was tired the next day, but she did her best not to let it show. The girls were mostly well-behaved except for one small temper tantrum because Millie didn't think she should have to take a nap anymore. She wasn't a baby. Madelyn took it in stride, holding her and telling her why naps were important, while Mary went to their room quietly. If you don't take naps, you'll never grow up big and strong. You want to be strong enough to keep house and have your own children, don't you? Millie nodded, resting her tired head on Madelyn's shoulder. I do. So you need to nap. Someday you'll be able to stop napping, and I will be the first person to let you when it's time. For now, you need to nap so you can grow. Madelyn carried her into her room and put her in the bed next to her sister. You sleep sweet now. I love you. Millie smiled sleepily. I love you, too, Mama. Madelyn left and let the curtain fall behind her, a smile on her face. No matter how her girls acted, she would love them with everything inside her. Well. What do we have here? Madelyn's eyes widened as she stared at Mr. Humphries. What are you doing here? How did you find me? Doesn't matter, does it? He walked toward her, and she backed up. What do you want? The same thing I've wanted all along. I want you. I've told you that you were meant to be mine for 6 months. What made you think that would change, just because you decided to go west and marry some Mountie? He looked around the cabin. The house I offered you was so much grander than this. But you didn't offer me love. I have 2 children now, and I have a wonderful husband. I would appreciate it if you left, please. She didn't mention to him that he made her skin crawl, but only because she was certain it would make him angrier than he already seemed to be. He laughed, the sound harsh in the small space. Have I ever left when you asked? Why do you even bother? He took another step toward her, and she frowned. The girls needed to be protected, so she couldn't run. What could she do? He reached for her, and she ducked under his arm, running toward the kitchen, the only place where there were weapons in her house. Bert carried a gun, but he took it with him when he'd gone to see if there was anyone he could help that morning. She fumbled open a drawer and chose the biggest, sharpest knife she had, and held it in front of her. Please don't make me use this, Mr. Humphries. She was well aware that there were no lawmen left in town, so there was no one she could turn to for help. He laughed at her again. You wouldn't know how to hurt someone. You're just fooling around with that thing. I would never hurt someone if it was just me involved. It's not. There are 2 innocent little girls in this house, and they will not be hurt. She had never imagined she would have such a strong maternal instinct, but she could see herself hurting him before she'd let him touch either of her babies. You'd never hurt anyone, no matter who was involved. Don't think you can fool me, Madelyn. He stepped toward her at the same time she brought up the knife. Grabbing his side, blood poured between his fingers. You stabbed me. With those words, he dropped to his knees, clutching his bleeding side with one hand and grabbing her ankle with the other. She dropped the knife onto the counter and picked up the frying pan she was about to wash, the pan she'd made lunch in. She brought it down on his head with a resounding whack, and he fell over. Madelyn immediately felt badly that she'd hurt him, but not bad enough that she would risk her girls. No, she needed help, and she needed it fast. She didn't want to leave him in the house with the girls, so she ran to the door and saw a woman who was vaguely familiar walking past her house. Excuse me, she called. The woman stopped, hurrying over to smile. You're the new wife of that nice Mountie boy. What's his name? Gilbert. I'm Madelyn. Would you mind running over to Andrew's house and asking his wife to come see me? I need her help with something. Madelyn kept the hand that was covered in blood behind her back so the other woman wouldn't see it. Oh, of course. Anything to help you ladies out. Being married to a Mountie can't be easy. The older woman rushed away, heading for Ida's house, and Madelyn went back inside to make sure Mr. Humphries didn't bother her girls. When Ida arrived 5 minutes later, Madelyn had already washed her hands to get the blood off them. She opened the door just a bit, letting Ida slip in beside her. "Mrs. Brown said you seemed a little panicked, so I left her with Lily. I thought it might be best if I came alone." Madelyn gestured to the man on her floor, partially hidden by the table. "He was my manager in Ottawa, and he wouldn't leave me alone. That's why I went to see Miss Hazel. Anyway, Mr. Humphries followed me, and he was threatening me, and I brought up a knife just as he stepped forward. And I stabbed him. I didn't mean to stab him. Ida, I need you to help me hide the body." "Hide the body? Is he dead?" Ida's eyes were wide as she stepped around her friend and stared down at the man on her floor. "I don't know. He grabbed my ankle after I stabbed him, so I hit him in the head with a frying pan. That knocked him out. I don't think it killed him, but it may have. Please help me hide him." Ida sighed heavily. "I'm not going to help you hide him. I'm going to do the logical thing and go and get some of the men who are working in town. They can take him to the jail, and one of them can stay with him until the Mounties make it back to town. But I have it all planned out. We'll smear lard all over him so he's easy to drag, and we'll put him in my room, so the girls don't see him when they wake up. I thought about using butter, but why would I waste perfectly good butter? We'll have to tie him up and gag him, but I think we'll be safe." Ida took Madelyn's hands in hers. "Look at me, Madelyn. We are not going to hide him. I'm leaving right now to go get some men to help us get him to the jail. If he wakes up, you hit him with your frying pan again. All right?" Madelyn looked over at Mr. Humphries lying there on the floor, still looking evil to her. "All right, but hurry. I need to clean up the blood before the girls wake up." Her girls did not need to be scarred for life by the blood of someone she'd knocked out in their kitchen. "You worry about the oddest things." With those words, the other woman left, and Madelyn sat on the other side of the table from the man, her frying pan in her hands. She understood that she wasn't thinking things through clearly, so she would follow Ida's instructions exactly. Thankfully, he didn't move or make a sound until Ida came back with 2 men from town. "We'll help you with him, Mrs. Keeler. You just stay there." Madelyn still gripped her frying pan in her hands, ready to use it if Mr. Humphries woke up. "I didn't mean to hurt him." She knew that she must seem like a terrible person to them. She wanted to explain that she didn't usually stab people and then hit them over the head with a frying pan. "Don't worry, ma'am. Mrs. Clark explained everything. We'll make sure he doesn't hurt anyone until the Mounties come back." After the men had carried him out the door, Madelyn started shaking and crying. "Why do I always fall apart after the danger is over?" she asked Ida, who was sitting beside her. "Because while everything is happening, you're busy making sure everyone you love is safe. Afterward, you have time to melt a little." Ida patted Madelyn on the knee. "Do you want me to clean up the blood?" "No, I'll do it. I made him bleed, therefore it's my job to clean up the blood." Madelyn's gaze met Ida's. "Why did he follow me here?" "I'm not sure, but I'm glad he didn't hurt you." Ida watched as Madelyn cleaned up her floor. "I'm going to go and get Lily. I don't think you should be alone this afternoon. You're pretty shaken up." Madelyn started to protest that she and the girls would be fine, but she knew they wouldn't. She needed her friend there, and she'd lean on her. What else could she do? She made a simple supper for the 5 of them, allowing the girls to play. Ida talked to her, and offered to help, but Madelyn had a need to keep her hands busy, so she refused. "What are we going to do if the men don't make it back tonight?" Madelyn asked softly. She wasn't ready to be left alone with the girls yet. She wasn't worried she'd hurt them, but she was still shaking and nervous, and she was afraid she'd make them nervous, too. "I'll stay here then. I can share your bed, and we can tuck Lily in with the twins. It won't be a problem." "Are you sure?" Madelyn asked. She needed her there, but she didn't want to interfere with her life. "I'm positive." In fact, I'm going to run home right now and get clothes for Lily and me just in case we do need to spend the night. Hopefully we won't, but we'll be ready. Madelyn looked at Ida and smiled slightly. Thank you for being my friend. Ida just smiled before hurrying out the door. Madelyn stirred the huge pot of soup she had made, hoping it would be Bert eating it with her and not Ida and Lily. She loved her friend, but she needed her husband badly. Bert and Andrew were still miles from home when darkness set in. We're going to have to stay here, aren't we? Bert asked. I was gone all last week. I hope Madelyn doesn't think this is normal. I don't think she will. Andrew spotted a flat area of land. Let's just camp there tonight. We'll head back first thing in the morning. I'm glad we haven't found any fatalities. For a storm that size, it's downright miraculous. Bert dismounted and went about getting out his tent and setting up camp. Do you want to start the fire? Or should I? I don't think it really matters. The girls had been asleep for over an hour when Madelyn finally gave up watching for the Mounties. They're not coming tonight, are they? Ida shook her head. I told you that as soon as the sun went down. And I didn't listen. I haven't been good at listening at all today, have I? The two ladies had done the dishes together, and they'd worked on sewing together all evening. Madelyn had gotten very little done, because she'd been up and down, watching out the window, hoping for the sounds of horses' hooves. She'd heard Chip a couple of times, and the bison had actually rolled around in the mud of her backyard, but she had heard nothing from the Mounties at all. You've been fine. You've had a very trying day. I don't think the girls have any idea that something happened here. Good. I don't want them to be traumatized because of my actions. Don't you go blaming yourself for that man following you here, Madelyn. I won't allow it. Ida put her sewing down and stood up, putting her hands on her hips. You were the victim here. There was nothing you could have done to prevent what happened to you. Madelyn sighed. I hope I feel better in the morning. I really hate that this happened. I think you'll feel better when Bert comes back. You need to tell him everything that happened so you know he doesn't blame you for it. Ida shook her head. I know he won't blame you for it, but I think that's what's in the back of your mind, isn't it? Madelyn nodded, a tear escaping again. I hope you're right. I put his children in danger by coming here. How can he forgive that? I hope the men hurry because I can talk until I'm blue in the face, but you're not going to believe me. You need Bert here to talk to you. I do. I really do. Madelyn was up before the sun as usual, going to the kitchen to start breakfast. She was still shaky, but not quite as bad as she'd been the night before. She made a big breakfast of bacon, pancakes, and scrambled eggs. When Ida joined her, she was just finishing up the eggs. Oh, good morning. Did you sleep all right? Ida nodded. I did. She looked at the breakfast and shook her head. I can't believe you got up early and cooked. I was going to come out and do it for you. Madelyn shook her head. No, you're my guest. And you kept me from hiding a man in my bedroom after tying him up yesterday. Only a true friend does that. Ida laughed. I tried to be a true friend, but I did that as much for me as I did it for you. I didn't want to touch him enough to smear that lard all over him. Madelyn laughed. I'm glad it didn't come to that. She wondered if Mr. Humphries was alive or dead. She wasn't sure she'd be able to live with the guilt if she'd killed a man, even one as vile as Mr. Humphries. So am I. 3 little girls came running into the kitchen in their nightgowns then, so the talk changed from that of hiding bodies to discussing how the girls had slept. It was a much safer topic of conversation. Chapter 10. About a mile from town, Bert got a strange feeling that they needed to get back immediately. He'd felt the same at the campsite that morning. Something was definitely wrong. I think something happened to our ladies. Andrew gave him an odd look, but he didn't say a word, simply following him into town, their pace much faster than it had been. They stopped in front of the jail, and swung down, going into the office. Bert stopped short when he got inside the Mountie office. Mr. Geller, the proprietor of the mercantile, was sitting at the desk there. A man he'd never seen before was in jail. What's going on here? Mr. Geller stood up, shaking his head. This man went to your house while you were gone. He threatened your wife, and she stabbed him, and then hit him over the head with a frying pan. He's been awake a few times, and cussing up a storm. I don't think he's grievously injured, but one of you Mounties should probably take a look, seeing as how you all know first aid and everything. Bert looked at Andrew. Can you see to him? I need to make sure my wife and girls are all right. He didn't wait for a response as he turned and sprinted down the street toward his house. He threw open the door, finding Ida and Madelyn sitting at the table, both of them with sewing on their laps, and a big pot of something that smelled wonderful cooking on the stove. Maddie? I just heard. Are you all right? Madelyn carefully set her sewing on the table, stood up, and ran to her husband, throwing herself into his arms. It was awful. After that, he couldn't tell what she said because she was crying and talking at the same time, and it came out sounding so garbled, he was sure no one would have been able to decode it. Bert held Madelyn close as he looked at Ida, hoping her explanation would make more sense than his wife's had. He'd caught something about lard and hiding a body, but nothing else was clear enough to understand. Ida stood up. Mr. Humphreys followed her here. She got to a knife, and he walked into it. When he grabbed her ankle, she clobbered him over the head with her frying pan. She sent for me, thinking we should rub lard on him to make him slide easier, and put him in your bedroom, but I talked her into getting some of the men in town to put him in jail and stay with him until you came back. She's fine. The girls are fine. I'm going to go home now, so you can comfort your wife. She's sure you're going to hate her for bringing danger into your home. Ida walked to the girls' room and lifted the sheet. Lily, it's time for us to go home now. Lily nodded obediently. I'll see my friend soon? Very soon. We just lived down the street. Bert watched Ida leave with Lily, still holding his wife close. Thank you. Ida nodded, opening the door and leaving. Are you ready to talk to me? He asked, stroking his hand over Madelyn's back. She shook her head, keeping her face buried in his neck. It was awful. He understood every word she said, and he took that as a good sign. What was awful? Tell me how it happened. She pulled back, accepted the handkerchief he offered, and wiped her nose and face. I put the girls down for their nap yesterday afternoon, and when I came out of their room, Mr. Humphreys was here. He scared me. I understand. Did he hurt you? She shook her head, wiping her eye with the back of her hand. He came toward me and tried to grab me, but I ducked under his arm and ran to the kitchen, and pulled out the biggest knife I could find. She told him in detail everything that had happened. I was so scared the girls would wake up and see him lying on the floor, or see the blood after we got him moved, but the girls didn't wake up and see him or the blood, did they? He was mildly panicked that his girls could have seen it, but more that his wife had to go through so much with him gone. They didn't. They slept through it all. They didn't wake up until Lily came over to play with them, and by that time, Mr. Humphreys was in jail and the blood had been mopped up. Well, thank you for shielding my girls from that. He put his hands on her shoulders and held her at arm's length for a moment. You have no idea the fear that went through me when I realized you had an intruder while I was gone. I should have been here. She shook her head. You were doing your job. Risking your life for the good people of White Fox. It's my fault we were in danger. I'm the one he came here after. Do not blame yourself for this, Maddie. I don't blame you one little bit. It was entirely his fault for following you here and for making you want to leave Ottawa in the first place. Do you really think so? She asked. She'd been holding her breath for his reaction to the whole situation, so worried he would blame her for it. You did everything you could to keep my girls from being part of it. You worked hard, and I appreciate that. He leaned down and brushed his lips across her forehead. I am pleased with your reaction. You defended them and yourself. Did he die? No, he's not dead. He was complaining all night from what I understand. Andrew was looking at his wound, but he'll be going to prison. He won't be allowed to hurt you or anyone else for a long time. Bert had to bite back his anger. He'd put many men in prison, but never one who had sinned against his family. He wanted to go down to the jail and punch the man, but he knew it was not the right thing to do. Madelyn looked up at him, a bit startled. Prison? Yes, he entered our home without being invited in. He followed you across the country. He was bothering you after you made it clear you weren't interested before you even left to come here. He'll do time. I promise you that. She bit her lip for a moment, thinking about what he said. I made a cake for dessert. Are you hungry for lunch? He took her words as a need to stop talking about the situation, and he was happy to oblige. I'm hungry. We didn't take the time for breakfast this morning. Something told me we needed to get home. I'm so glad you hurried. An hour later, lunch dishes were finished, and the girls were down for their nap. As soon as they were settled, Bert took Madelyn's hand and led her outside. I did a lot of thinking while I was gone. Madelyn looked at him. Was this where he told her they would only ever be parents together? They would never have a real marriage? You did? I'm almost afraid to hear this. He held her hand in his, slowly stroking his thumb over her palm. I was as worried for you as I was for my girls when I heard there'd been an intruder. Do you know what that tells me? She shook her head. No. It tells me I love you, just as much as I love my little girls. He looked into her eyes. I want to have a real marriage with you, Maddie. I'm done with sleeping beside you and never touching you. Her face lit up slowly, as she let his words sink in. Really? You love me? He nodded. I do. I never intended to love you. I thought I'd be married to you and spend the rest of my life loving Sally. He sighed. I need to stop by her grave and talk to her one last time. I need to let her know that I found a new mother for her girls who loves them with all her heart. I do love them. And I also love you, Bert. I'm so glad I got that letter from Miss Hazel. He folded his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. So you're willing to have a real marriage now? And children? I want more children. The girls will be rotten if we don't give them siblings. She laughed. I wanted a real marriage with you from the first day we met. I knew I was falling for you immediately, but I also knew you were still in love with Sally. Sally will always hold a small piece of my heart. She was my first love and the mother of my girls. She was my past. He looked into her eyes. But you are my future. We'll be together forever. She heard loud stomping and turned her head, and there was Chip. It was like he was welcoming her to White Fox and wanted her to stay. Forever doesn't sound nearly long enough. We'll just have to make the most of every single minute of it.